Games as objects of analysis are what my channel is dedicated toward. It's what I spend a lot of my time thinking about and researching and writing. It's who I am, a person who loves games so much I dedicate a part of myself to writing about them. My last two giant analysis videos were about games I loved, but not games that come anywhere near close to the emotional impact that this one has on me. Silent Hill 2 is a monolith, one that's hard to approach in any fresh way. It's been discussed and analyzed to death. But I think a lot of the perspectives that I gleaned from the work are still not meaningfully represented in this discussion. Silent Hill 2 is a thing of beauty to me, one of the greatest works of human art that I've ever experienced. Maybe it's silly to say something so grandiose about it, but I don't care. It's honestly the only game, aside from maybe Majora's Mask or Disco Elysium, that I would describe that way. So it's time to give it its due. Let's talk about everything that Silent Hill 2 is, and what makes it so special. I don't much subscribe to auteur theory, the idea that a work of art can be boiled down to a sole creative behind it. Even in the case of something like a novel, where the person who wrote it is the only person calling the shots in most cases, there are still outside influences that can be a big part of the process. I think that the overall thematic narrative of Team Silent and their games are largely indicative of this. While there are similar team members between projects like musician Akira Yamaoka, many of them have completely different people working on them. Despite this, the four Team Silent games form one cohesive and beautiful narrative together, in addition to each being a great standalone story, which really impresses me. Silent Hill 2 began production immediately after the completion of the first game in 1999, which is an extraordinarily impressive development cycle for the game to have, considering it came out in 2001. The game's story was originally conceived by the game's CGI director Takayoshi Sato, who says that it was based on the Dostoevsky novel Crime and Punishment, something that I'll be coming back to throughout the work, although he was not the only influence on the writing of the scenario. The main writing was done by Hiroyuki Owaku, the official scenario writer for the project, and Sato himself, who did most of the dialogue for the female characters. The game's budget was vastly increased to become a AAA production of a few $1 million. Hey, remember when AAA games were experimental? And the team greatly appreciated the freedom this allowed for them, especially after some of the troubles that were faced during the development of Silent Hill 1. The decision to focus work on the PS2 came naturally. It was where the market's focus was going at the time, and it was the console they had the most information about, though an Xbox port was developed simultaneously. Keeping in mind the feedback that they had received on the first game, and bringing on an additional 30 people to the 20 original people at Team Silent, they debuted the game at Tokyo Game Show 2001 to positive reactions. As a psychological horror game, Silent Hill 2 focuses a lot on the environments of the town of Silent Hill. However, development had more room to focus on the game's plot this time, because a lot of that setup had already been explored in the first Silent Hill game, which is one of the many reasons you should play that before you play Silent Hill 2, despite how some people say they're totally disconnected for some reason. The improved hardware of the PlayStation 2 allowed for some interesting atmospheric changes to the environments. The fog surrounds our protagonist as opposed to being an imposing wall, which is more isolating even if both are haunting. And the shadows of enemies grow in size as you approach them with a light. The game's camera angles are powerful, and even though it was a hard balance for the developers to strike between cinematic shots and hampering the gameplay, it ultimately turned out to be a pretty good synergy. As for the direction itself, it takes a lot of inspiration from the works of Cronenberg, Fincher, Lynch, and Hitchcock, as well as the film Jacob's Ladder, of course, which is kind of just all of Silent Hill. The art direction pulls mainly from the artistry of Francis Bacon, Rembrandt, and Wyeth. For 3D environments, they took a surprising amount of inspiration from Tomb Raider of all places, and of course Alone in the Dark as well, which essentially invented survival horror as a genre. Daijoro Moroshi and Junji Ito were also big influences. Yamaoka's score is absolutely legendary in the way that it values percussion and strange instruments over the traditionally melodic scores that we come to associate with video games. He wrote one of the few tracks that does prioritize a melody, the main theme of the game, in just 3 days, which is incredible because it's just an incredible song, sad and lonely and listless like so much of what Silent Hill 2 is. Speaking of which, we should probably start to discuss the game proper now. What's the deal with Silent Hill 2?
I got a letter.
We open Silent Hill 2 on a shot of a man's face. This is James Sunderland, our protagonist for the duration of the game's story. James is an interesting character. His pretty basic attire is covered by a military jacket, presumably his father Frank's, as James wasn't old enough to have served in Vietnam, seeing as this game takes place in the early 90s and James is only in his late 20s. While a callback to the protagonist of the film Jacob's Ladder and his own military uniform jacket, James wearing one does indicate some things about him very early. He's guarded. He's concealing something. The name James brings to mind one of Jesus' biblical apostles. That James was judged for something and lost his life for it, perhaps a sign of things to come. Sunderland, meanwhile, indicates some kind of sundering within James, of course. A split between two sides. Consider Raskolnikov from Crime and Punishment. That book concerns itself greatly with duality, a side of the book where there is no knowledge of his crimes, and a side of the book where he is avoiding the people who do know. Does James himself have a crime? Perhaps that's why he's reflecting in this dark and grimy mirror. Perhaps that's why he's so obscured in shadow. He almost appears to be preparing himself for something. Whatever it is, he makes a repetitive gesture with his hand, one that we'll come back to again later. You might feel as if James is looking directly at you in the mirror in this scene. It's hard to see because his face is in the shadows, but if you turn the brightness up, he is absolutely directly looking at you. Is he judging you for sitting back and observing his story, for partaking in it? And then, as soon as you have time to process all of this, James moves away from the mirror. The game takes a natural shift from pre-rendered to real-time rendering. The direction of Silent Hill 2 takes advantage of these two visual styles and melds them to great effect. The surreal abstraction of the FMVs meeting the cold, hard reality of the real-time animations in a way that evokes a lot of the dualistic themes of Silent Hill 2 and Silent Hill as a whole. We find James standing alone in a public rest stop bathroom. As a possible reflection of his own mental state, it's worn down and graffiti covers the walls. The writing is incomprehensible in the state it's in the game, as James's own thoughts are as well. He has a blank expression. Unreadable. As the name of the staticky song that hums in the background suggests, white noise, there is a barrage of ideas that are undecipherable. We aren't privy to anything that's going on with him, and we'll find soon that he doesn't seem to be either. There are only two things we can truly make out along the wall, one being a poster that reads Heaven's Night with a picture of a woman on it. A name like Heaven's Night indicates a darker side to a place of pleasant experiences, so probably something like a bar or a strip club. The clarity of this image will come to make more sense as the plot progresses and as we come to know more about James's vices. The other image, however, resembles some depictions of the mythological creature Lilith. While her connection to actual theology is extremely tenuous and she actually originates from a satirical text, there is a general cultural idea of Lilith as the first wife of Adam who is not subservient to him and thus became a demon. Maybe James has some weird opinions on women and the roles they should play in relation to men that we're going to be exposed to throughout our playthrough. He speaks his first line of dialogue.
Mary, could you really be in this town?
We now have some inkling as to his motivation, but who is Mary? We'll find out more about her in a bit, but she shares many similarities with the most famous cultural Mary, the biblical one. She's a symbol of purity, of kindness, of motherhood. I mean, Mary's maiden name in this game is even Shepherd, which was Joseph of Bethlehem's profession in the Bible. This automatically associates James's Mary with those ideas as well, though we have yet to see how applicable they are. Mary was also said to have been named for one of Jack the Ripper's victims, a woman known for being angry when she was inebriated. This too may come into play in our understanding of James's own Mary. Let's get out of this bathroom. We find James at a rest stop just outside the town of Silent Hill, the fog wall the series is known for thick around him. He rests his arms on a wall nearby overlooking Toluca Lake, an area from the first game which has a lot of relevance here as well. Toluca Lake is an interesting place, its relevance in the game's language being very special. Toluca is derived from the Aztec word Tolucan, which means place of the gods. Silent Hill is a place of gods, though their presence isn't felt as directly in this particular installment, and lakes in particular are places of great spiritual significance in folklore the world over. Much as James started the game looking in an artificial mirror, lakes were the first natural mirrors for mankind, possibly the first places we looked upon ourselves in full and understood what we were. They're often gateways to other worlds, like the Fey lands of Celtic folklore or the yokai realm of Shintoism. So it being the center of Silent Hill, the focal point of its mysticism, makes a lot of sense. It's also here, on this quiet lakeside, that we get the first part of my favorite piece of voice acting in any game ever.
In my restless dreams, I see that town, Silent Hill. You promised you'd take me there again someday, but you never did. Well, I'm alone there now, in our special place, waiting for you.
The vocal direction the Team Silent directed Silent Hill games in general is phenomenal. Well, aside from one of the characters in Silent Hill 4, there's this off-kilter air about it. It's stilted, but in a surprisingly human way. It feels really natural and allows the emotion to shine through. The words of the letter speak of a promise that James made, one to bring Mary back to Silent Hill someday. An interesting discrepancy between the English and Japanese version of the script here is that in Japanese, the phrasing that Mary uses states that it was also not James's fault that he never brought her back here. Still, I don't think it reads very accusatory in English regardless. Something interesting to note is that while Mary's letter is read out, we gain a lot of distance from James. Most of the game we will be in an intimate space with him, the camera focused nearby, but here we feel separated from him. Almost as if he doesn't want to let us in on what's truly going on in a rare moment of vulnerability, reading a letter from someone he clearly cares about. It's also as the camera pans away that we see that James has left the door to his car wide open and proceeds to leave it this way for the rest of the game. There seems to be no regard for himself or any of his belongings. His mind is only focused on his goal, to find his wife, Mary, who is also dead. Dead from a disease that took her life 3 years ago. James's willingness to believe his wife was alive just because he got a letter claiming to be from her is pretty concerning and tells us a lot more about him. He's been really distraught ever since she died and is clinging to any way he can have her back, even if that means following strange leads. Though the letter didn't specify where her special place was, James speculates that it's at the park by the lake since they spent most of their day in Silent Hill there. The song that plays in this section is known as Prologue Fairy Tale, which is an interesting way to refer to the romance that James and Mary had. From what we know, they seem like they had a pretty good relationship, one that might be depicted in a fairy tale. However, much like something that Hans Christian Andersen might have written, it had an extremely tragic end, a death from a disease, and maybe the relationship wasn't as happy as it seemed if it could be described as prosonic. Perhaps one of them felt trapped in the relationship by the end of it all. We regain control of James. Checking his inventory reveals the aforementioned letter, but also a photo of Mary before she was ill, which brings up some questions. Why did James feel the need to bring a photo of her with him when he went to go look for her? Did he think that he wouldn't recognize her anymore after all these years? Or maybe he feels he needs to protect himself. Mary is a saintly figure after all. It's only natural he'd feel some spiritual protection from that. Also, I hate to mention this, but she's dressed like the mom from Con Air. They're definitely going for a maternal vibe with Mary, despite her and James not having any children that we know of. After picking up the map of Silent Hill from the driver's seat in James's car, showing that he at least has the common sense still left in him to remember his map, we can try entering Silent Hill through the main road. It's mysteriously closed off, though, in spite of the distorted welcome sign that hangs above the fence. Sorry, welcome sign. Already the town is showing some of its signs of disrepair. It has clearly seen better years, much like our protagonist's own psyche. A road sign above this states Paleville 10 miles. Seems like Silent Hill isn't the only town nearby with an ominous name, and seeing as it's on the other side of the lake, perhaps it's some kind of reference to crossing beyond the Pale, a phrase for going to the other side of some kind of moral boundary, where a trek across the lake may be seen as a spiritual journey due to the superstition surrounding it. Another nearby town is called Brams, perhaps a reference to how Silent Hill is a holy site, seeing as the surname Bram is derived from the Abrahamic, Abraham. And, of course, Old Silent Hill refers to the place the protagonist went in the first Silent Hill game, one of the few direct references to that experience. Speaking of places, let's take a look at our recently acquired map. To really hammer home James descending into darkness, the place that he came from in order to get to Silent Hill is literally called Pleasant River, which sounds like a much nicer place to be. In the town of Silent Hill proper, designated as South Vale here, a lower valley between the peaks of the hills, there are many streets with interesting names. Vox Road seems to be in reference to Andrew Vox, an attorney who exclusively represented children in court. Seeing as how Alessa essentially created Silent Hills, we know it based on her own experiences before the events of the first game, it makes sense that the town would protect children on some level, even after she's not controlling it anymore. Meanwhile, Wilt's Road seems to refer to Wiltshire, in turn, which refers to the name Wilton, or by a farm in a spring. Judging by this road's proximity to a farm, it makes sense. The name Lindsay for a road also fits pretty well here. It means by a marsh, and Lake Toluca naturally creates marshes near it. Rounding out the purely ecological names, Sandford literally means a sandy ford, which makes sense since it's on the bank of the lake. Martin Street goes with the town's theological vibe, both with the fact that the name Martin means related to the Roman god Mars, but also much more obviously referring to the Protestant reformant Martin Luther. The town of Silent Hill itself seems to follow some kind of reformed Abrahamic denomination, as most of the religious iconography and symbolism we find here is associated with those religions, but it's obviously also something completely different entirely with the pantheon of gods they worship. Katz also follows this religious naming scheme. It's a German surname referring to righteous priesthood. Neely Street, a similarly named for, or vice versa, the bar that's on it, refers to the fact that said bar is closed, which we will soon find out upon our visit there. Of course, Carroll Street is simply a reference to author Lewis Carroll, whose story about going through a looking glass to another world is very similar to Silent Hill's own brushes with the other world. It's less fitting here than it is in Silent Hill 1, however. There's another thing that Carroll Street ends up tying into later, and is probably the canonical source of the street's name, but we'll talk about that then. The main road that goes through Silent Hill is Nathan Avenue, which is obviously a biblical reference. Nathan was a prophet and messenger to King David, and Nathan Avenue acts as a means for James to reach the truth since it's the most direct path forward. A prophetic path leading to a harrowing message. Let's look at some of the landmarks here, starting with what James has underlined, Rosewater Park. It's interesting that it's named Rosewater. Rosewater is often thought of a medical treatment for skin conditions, regardless of its actual efficacy. Did whatever Mary have to do with her skin? Of course, Mary is also pretty similar to a rose itself. Beautiful and delicate, and possibly a little thorny if her character's Jack the Ripper-related inspiration is accurate. On the other side of the lake are the Lakeview Hotel and the Lakeside Amusement Park, the latter of which simply being an area that was from Silent Hill 1 which we visited previously, but the former being completely new. We'll be getting more into the hotel much later. Many of the other buildings here are simple indicators of place, stuff like a market or a burger chain or a bank. Texon Gas and Pete's Bolorama are just names that feel right. Jack's Inn is an interesting joke. In the novel and film The Shining, the main character Jack Torrance comes into possession of a haunted hotel. There are some parallels between him and James Sunderland that we will explore later. There's a church here named for Saint Stella, another divine reference, as Stella is another form of celestial. Heaven's Night is also visible, that mysterious place. Two buildings of note are the Woodside and Blue Creek apartments, both places named for different beautiful aspects of nature, but also both rooted in mysticism themselves. The Wood of Forests and the Crossing of Creeks are seen as fairly magical in several European folklores. Many fey creatures can't cross over streams, for instance, and fairies are highly associated with the forest. Even outside of Europe, forests are often seen as strange and ethereal places. To beat this dead horse a bit more, this town obviously has something supernatural going on. With our lengthy geography all out of the way, James takes his first trip off the beaten path and on the dirt road into Silent Hill, marking the first of many times James will take an unconventional path forward. It is also one of the first times that James descends throughout this game. Further and further into the strange world of Silent Hill and also his own mind, ascension isn't a regular occurrence in this space, with that being purely relegated to moments of James being enlightened. Being forced to take a dirt path through a foggy wood further makes the world of Silent Hill feel mystical and like you're crossing over to the other side when you go through them. There's also something truly uncomfortable just about this dirt road. Aside from the obvious isolation of it and how close the camera is to James, it's just a really long venture. Not so long that it's boring, but long enough for it to be noticeable. It's a single beat off. On the side of the path, you come across a well. More connections to water, of course, but it's what's inside the well that piques our interest. A single red square. When James looks at it, he says it makes him feel like someone's groping around inside his skull. Then the save screen opens, James' distorted red reflection staring at you. What is supposed to be a moment of safety, the save screen is disturbed here. Instead, there is the haunting, almost guilty face of a man with a dead-eyed, blank expression. And why the bottom of a well? Is it because of the reflective properties of water, or is it because James is drowning in something? Past an imposing gate, we enter a graveyard where the fog seems even thicker than usual, perhaps a form of the spirits leaving their mark on this place. A graveyard is already a pretty unsettling locale to come across, but the fog enhances it to feel dreamlike. It also appears that part of the graves are sinking into the ground here due to Lake Toluca overflowing, yet another sign of how things are off-kilter. The song playing here is a synthy track titled Forest, which is an obvious allusion to it being in a forest, but also brings to mind how often forests can be associated with death and spirits in mythology. A graveyard in a forest fits all too well. Forests are, of course, where the yokai realm connects the most with ours in Shintoism. Helping this is again the presence of a small pond with its reflective water, and of course a large church in the back of the area. It's here we are introduced to one of my favorite characters of all time, but we won't learn her name for a bit. We learn a few things about this lady the instant we meet her. She's dressed in clothes that are extremely covering, a turtleneck sweater and jeans, and dark hair that covers the side of her face. Her sweater is pure white, communicating some kind of emotional purity to us due to the unfortunately racist semiotics that we have surrounding that color. She also looks like she's an older woman with an aged complexion. This is juxtaposed with her usage of the word mama to refer to her mother, which she quickly changes to mother, presumably because she's embarrassed by her usage of a word typically associated with children. Though she looks old and her amazing vocal performance from Donna Burke sounds old, she's clearly much younger. It's never stated in the game, but she is 19 years old. Her mannerisms also indicate that something very traumatic has happened to her. She's extremely reactive and hyper-alert at all times. She screams the second James greets her, and her speech is pretty unpredictable. This becomes more apparent later. The moment James says he's going into town despite her telling him that it's dangerous, she immediately gets defensive. She thinks that he doesn't believe her. Maybe she's regularly not trusted. She claims to be looking for her mother in Silent Hill, but why is she looking for her in the graveyard? Moreover, why did she expect to find her father and brother in this graveyard? Are they dead? Maybe she wishes they were. Regardless, James does that tick where he puts his hand to his head again and walks off from the conversation. Something interesting is that he can stick around and actually interact with her, which is a first for the Silent Hill series. In the first game, character interactions only occurred in cutscenes. It's nothing groundbreaking, James just makes some awkward small talk and she reacts poorly, but it adds a little more character to James, showing that he's at least someone who tries to make friends. Tries being the operative word. After this brief meeting, James continues along the path into Silent Hill, his footsteps the only sound to accompany us over the haunting track world of madness. Until they aren't. Another pair of footsteps is heard behind James until he crosses through a gate into a more industrial area, a paved road on a hill as opposed to a dirt one. Whatever was following him only exists within the confines of the spiritual forest. It's also here that we see a poster referencing The Shining, namely the scene where Jack Torrance pops through a door in order to kill his wife. James and Jack are both men who came to a haunted place to search for something they had lost. Jack's inspiration as a writer, James his wife. And in another eerie detail, James was originally supposed to be named Jack, as a reference to Jack the Ripper. I'm fairly certain Jack Torrance's name in The Shining itself was partially chosen for this Jack the Ripper connection as well. It's an interesting choice, and over the course of the story, the supernatural places they visit reveal the true colors of both men. But finally, after another few minutes of running along the road, James will enter Silent Hill proper. One of the first things we see is a table full of rusted gardening tools meant for nurturing. Why are they in such disrepair? Perhaps it's another sign of Mary's declining health, as she is representative of nurturing, the ultimate Western literary mother figure. The rusty textures of the tools representing her fading life and ultimate demise, leading to no more gardening being done. As James continues down the road, he finds a bloody trail. On the other end of it is a strange figure that's hard to make out in the fog. All we can see for now is its grotesquely colored flesh and its lack of arms, in addition to how it shambles. And seeing how James is just such a genius, he has the great idea to follow it. It's along this path that we encounter an interesting monument that discusses some of the history of Silent Hill as a town. Namely that there's a swamp here created by the Toluca Lake, as I discussed previously, which the town was built over. However, there's another detail that we learned by filling in the blanks on this plaque here. The swamp used to be called the Blood Swamp. Why is that? The executioners of the town washed their tools here. Again, water is associated with otherworldly imagery and death, and we learn more of the town's sordid history. Perhaps we'll come to learn more about these executioners at some point, but for now, this is only a striking and ethereal mental image. The game eventually leads you to a tunnel where the sound of radio static crackles through the impasse, preventing you from going inside. James proceeds to pick up the radio, ignoring the monster that we saw earlier, who is getting up and ready to attack James. Now that we have a better look at the creature, we can see that it's a lying figure, named for Mary when she was sick in bed in the hospital, who was lying on her deathbed in wait for him. The straitjacket-like opening on it must be a James invention, though. Perhaps he thought she should be institutionalized for some reason. Perhaps he blames her for her death. In some ways, it's also vaginal, which implies some repressed sexuality coming from James. It even vomits out bile at you, which might have been a symptom of Mary's illness. For a first enemy, it makes quite an impression. It's here that we have our first combat encounter of the game, obviously, and it certainly feels a lot different than most video game combat does. Attacks are slow and weighty, and there's a lot of deliberation from James when making a move. It feels grounded and very restricting, perfect for a game like this. What makes you feel even more trapped here than just the combat restrictions is the fact that you are literally trapped in an isolated tunnel with impasses on either side. Once James goes out of the enclosed space again, he'll check the radio he picked up. Curiously, Mary's voice is on the other side, but it's so distorted that we can't quite make it out, much like James's own thoughts. How is she still alive? Is she still alive? James doesn't stop to think about the answer to those questions and puts the radio away in his pocket. The radio has some gameplay functionality in alerting you to where the monsters are, which is an aspect they have throughout each of the games. Radios themselves are often portrayed as having the ability to communicate with spirits in popular culture, such as ghost shows. Electricity in general being seen as somewhat supernatural adjacent. Needless to say, the disembodied yet hard to make out voice of a dead woman coming through the radio does have some precedent culturally. Upon returning to the town, some caution tape that James came across earlier will have disappeared, allowing you to continue forward through the town. Why it disappeared is anyone's guess, but perhaps the town saw James's defeat of the lying figure to be indicative that he was prepared enough to venture deeper. His willingness to confront only a small piece of his thoughts around the situation regarding Mary is proof of that. Deeper in the town, we can find a small single-room trailer on the side of the road. Within this confined space, there's a note that simply directs us to the local bar laying on the sofa. Perhaps James spent a lot of his time drinking while waiting to visit Mary in the hospital. Whatever the case, we set out for Neely's bar, where we encounter one of the most interesting messages that you can find in the game. Neely's bar is a completely empty room with a map of the town marked up in the corner, which is the sole gameplay purpose it really serves, to drive James in the direction of the Woodside Apartments. However, as we turn to leave, we see an interesting message on the wall.
There was a hole here. It's gone now.
This line is fairly iconic, and it deserves to be. An interesting representation of both the fact that there used to be a bar here, also known as a drinking hole, and also of how James would feel after drinking. It was one of the only ways for him to fill the hole inside him created by Mary's illness, though obviously it was only a temporary solution to that hole. The key to the apartments is found on a corpse in a dead end. It's specifically stated to be an old-looking key. Perhaps James associates the apartments and his domestic life with the act of aging in general. Perhaps he feels like he's losing his youth to his marriage, and that it'll lead to him dead and alone one day with many regrets. It's notable that all the corpses that we find in the game that aren't those of monsters are James's. He has a fixation on death that can't be denied. Also on the way to the apartments, we'll encounter the cockroach enemies for the first time. Aside from the obvious idea that James is afraid of cockroaches, I mean, who isn't? Perhaps these enemies represent a further resentment towards Mary than was already present before. Cockroaches are commonly associated with the idea of something that should die but doesn't, a creature that can even be put through a nuclear explosion and survive. Perhaps James felt this way about Mary, internally hateful and wishing she would just die already. Him seeing her as nothing more than a burden is one of the first disgusting things we learn about James. Finally, there is yet another corpse we can find here with notes scattered all around it. These notes are a diegetic yet optional tutorial for the player if they somehow haven't already figured out how the enemy mechanics work, but they also give us some interesting information. Not everyone in Silent Hill sees the monsters. There's some way that the town determines who sees the horror. It seems to be mainly based on the trauma of people's past manifesting, seeing as how James are oddly connected to them. The literal personal demons to go with the metaphorical ones. Just what does it say about James that demons follow him everywhere? With this all fresh in our mind, we enter the apartments, the first true area of the game.
Besides, is what we deserve.
Inside, the apartments are utterly worn down, as if they haven't been maintained in years. The comparison is pretty obvious here. James's home life with Mary was not as good as it seemed on the surface, as well as just being the town's general reflection of James's fractured mental state. The endless identical hallways of the apartments make for a chilling atmosphere. It's hard not to get lost in them, get lost in the shuffle of day-to-day life. There's a chilling familiarity to these places, one that's present throughout all of Silent Hill as a series, of course, but I think it's at one of its peaks here. Woodside Apartments is as average as it gets, and the average is terrifying. The status quo is terrifying, a Sisyphean nightmare. It's here that we hear the track Silent Heaven play. This song's title refers to what Mary and James saw Silent Hill as when they visited, a heaven that they stayed together in, an idealized memory that James has all to himself. This also ties back to that Heaven's Night place we saw earlier on the map. Whatever that location is, it must be the quote-unquote dark side of Silent Hill, or Heaven. It most likely plays in the apartments because James also idealizes his domestic life with Mary before she got ill to some degree as well, as some kind of peaceful and quiet happiness that the two shared. In one apartment, we find a mannequin wearing Mary's dress with a flashlight in its front pocket. This says a few things. Does James see Mary as an object? Considering everything we've learned about James from the imagery of this game so far, that would make sense. James has a lot of frankly grotesque disdain for Mary, but also the flashlight being here illustrates another thing. Mary's importance to James. She's a light in the dark for him, one that guides him forward and allows him to understand what he's looking at. She's the person who brought him to this town after all, both times. The one who started him on this journey to understand himself better, even if he doesn't realize it. Upon picking up the flashlight, a pair of mannequin legs comes to life and begins attacking James. And it's here that something else about James becomes brutally clear. James is really fucking horny. There's a lot to illustrate that he's sexually frustrated in some capacity, and the mannequin enemies are our first look at that. They're literally a pair of legs and a butt, and nothing else. Fitting that this ties into the room where we are first made to witness James's objectification of Mary, because he also seems to objectify all women on the whole. Something you'll notice that was also true of the first Silent Hill outing is the amount of doors that simply don't work in this apartment complex. While many would see this as lazy design in other games, Silent Hill makes it work by playing with your fear of the unknown. Checking every door just to see what's on the other side is an exercise in suspense, and it's almost more relieving when a door doesn't work. You don't have to go into another room and brace yourself for whatever threat might be on the other side. It's calming. While discussing this apartment complex, I'd like to take a little detour to talk a bit about my own life. Growing up, I lived in a lot of apartments. The apartments in Silent Hill 2, while rather Japanese-styled in their own right due to the interesting Amero-Japanese fusion that makes up these games' entire aesthetic, feels very reminiscent of my own homes from my youth in an eerie way. Silent Hill is the ultimate nowhere USA, and these rooms just make me feel even more nostalgic yet on edge. It's some beautiful stuff. In some of the rooms, you may hear some faint whispering. While unintelligible in the game, if we extract the sound file and listen to it on its own, it sounds like James's own voice. Go see my dead wife and come home and do laundry, or something to that effect. This may have been an average day for James when Mary first fell ill. He would go see her in the hospital and then do his chores, of course with work probably factoring in somewhere there as well. However, the most notable thing is how he refers to his wife. Go see my dead wife. James was a real piece of shit, wasn't he? We've only speculated on this beforehand, but this straight up confirms it to me. James saw Mary as already dead, as a burden that he hated. It's frankly disgusting, and it makes me upset just to think about. We'll talk about this more later. On the second floor, there's a series of iron bars with a key on the other side of it. James is yet again barred from the path forward. However, as he sticks his hand out to reach it, a little girl runs over and steps on his hand, then kicks the key away from him. As she runs off, she laughs at James. Whoever this girl is, she has something against James. Maybe it's got something to do with Mary, considering she's dressed like the daughter from Con Air, and Mary's dressed like the mother. Did James and Mary have a child we didn't know about? Perhaps the semiotic innocence of childhood also ties into her being a Christ-like figure, seeing as she's symbolically the child of Mary. So in some ways, this could be seen as a moment of divine judgment against James, the first of many. Also, that's the end of the Con Air talk for the video. I promise. With these thoughts in mind, we continue to search the apartments. In another room, we find a shopping cart with a handgun in it. This piece of imagery is intended to be a commentary on how easy it is to acquire firearms in the United States. With Columbine only a few years before this game's release, it's easy to see why Team Silent had this on their minds while working on Silent Hill 2. James himself may also fetishize guns in the same way that many Americans do, and perhaps he's grateful for how easy it is for them to be acquired. Or maybe this imagery appears because he thinks they are too accessible in the US. Knowing James, though, it's probably the former. His opinions on things tend to lean that way. The wall around the room is pockmarked with gunshots, a senseless act of violence gone by, only serving to destroy the room around the firearm. Traveling further into the apartments, a scream rings out in one of the halls. If you go in the direction of the scream, you'll see the iron bars once more, but instead of a key on the other side, there's a very strange creature who you are probably already acquainted with. This is the red pyramid thing, or pyramid head as he's more commonly known outside of the game. All it does is sit there and stare at James through the bars, silently, almost as if it sees James as a prisoner, condemning him. However, Pyramid Head's actions have led James to progression through the nightmare of Silent Hill here, so maybe it is both judgment and a forceful push toward whatever truth that James needs to learn. Pyramid Head's design itself I find fascinating. A gaunt, triangular helmet on a man wearing a butcher's smock, totally inhuman in the fact that you can't see his face. Maybe James, too, can't see himself anymore. The butcher's smock is a symbol of violence, even if it is specifically against animals. This Pyramid Head sees humans as meat to be slaughtered, or again, maybe James is the one who slaughters. Maybe he has some kind of blood on his hands. The creature also emits a red glow, the same one that the save points emit, the same ones that are places of reflection for James. If you try to kill Pyramid Head in any way, it will have no effect. He is beyond James's reach, and all we can do is enter the apartment adjacent to him. Here we are immediately greeted with what we can only assume is the corpse that Pyramid Head left behind, which is the exact corpse of James Sunderland himself, as is every corpse in the game. Pyramid Head's judgment of James is made viscerally clear from this action, the literal murder of his doppelganger. Also, take note of where James happens to be sitting, in an armchair in front of a television. Similar to what I said about his drinking habits, perhaps James would spend a lot of time in front of the television to get his mind off of Mary's illness, his mind not all there. Next to him is an unreadable and unknown newspaper, perhaps indicating that James wasn't even keeping up with what was going on around him during this horrible period in his life. Blooming flowers on the wallpaper are an ironic contrast to Mary's own life. Beautiful and delicate like her, but unlike her, they are living and thriving. The roses have so much life left in them, whereas Mary has nothing. A note is written here which primarily functions as the key to another puzzle, but it interestingly also refers to three figures as a form of poem: the fat, the tall, and the thin. While James isn't known for being tall, one can assume that is him, and the thin is the girl from the cemetery due to her spindly build. The fat we have yet to meet, though. The puzzle is also referring to the needles of a clock here, which is what the solution revolves around. Time is an interesting construct in Silent Hill. It doesn't seem to truly exist, and there are very few visible clocks within the game, none of them actually working, including this one. The name Scoth is mentioned toward the end of this poem, perhaps as a reference to Scotland, which is connected to the Celtic mythological inspirations that the series has as manifested in the Otherworld. One more interesting thing to note in this room is that there's an image of a chapel on the wall. While James makes no particular note of it, Silent Hill and religion are two entities that are inherently intertwined, and this imagery is one of our first tastes of it beyond James's deceased wife as the Virgin Mary. Silent Hill 2 in general is one of the ones that uses this symbolism directly the least, but I think its religious themes are still there, just not as obvious. As we'll come to see, it's very reminiscent of Abrahamic religious works, just not as Christian as 1 or 3 are. The key we find in this last room leads us to yet another room, this one full of cages. James feels trapped in his marriage, in a relationship with someone who he views as dead, which is a really gross way for him to frame his situation in his mind. Mary is not a burden, but James certainly thinks of her that way. The sink in this room glows red, almost as if James is afraid of his own reflection. After all, his reflection is reminiscent of the red pyramid thing. An adjacent room here is full of moths or butterflies, depending on how you look at them. Either way, they both represent a lot of different ideas in Shintoism specifically, mainly surrounding ideas of rebirth. This room can be seen as a microcosm of James's journey through the town, his own rebirth that comes from his experiences throughout it. It's also Mary. Has she been reborn in the town? We don't know, but there's a chance that she might have been. The other characters that go through the town also have the chance to be reborn in similar ways to James, and we'll get to see how they handle it. These bugs also crowd around James and obscure his vision, another reference to his clouded mind. In the wall here is a hole, another reference to holes in a game full of them. This one, however, is still here, and James has to stick his hand through it into the uncertainty of the darkness in order to acquire a key. While there is obviously an argument to be made for the psychosexual connotations of James putting something up a hole here in order to progress, I would like to focus more on the idea that James has to brave darkness in order to find the way forward. Pyramid Head reinforces this as well. He has to put himself in intentionally uncomfortable and potentially dangerous situations in order to help himself grow and mature. If we return to the room where we learned about the clock puzzle, we can find the actual clock here along with the names Henry, Mildred, and Scott etched into the wall. We know the name Scott from earlier, that he rests on 3 and 15, but who are Henry and Mildred? Henry represents the hour hand, which makes sense because Henry is a name that is derived from a term for leader, and the hour hand is the largest unit of time present on the clock. Mildred, meanwhile, is a mild strength, as is the minute hand, since its march through time often goes unnoticed when you stare at a clock. Of course, the names also just have the same first letters as the different clock hands, which is part of the puzzle, but it's interesting that they have double meanings like this. On the side of the clock is another message written in chalk. It's one of my favorite messages in the whole game, so I'll read it out for you.
The scars from the past shall remove the nail that stops time.
It's a beautifully simple statement. You have to confront the horrible things in your past in order to move on from them. You can't just ignore them. If James tries to move the clock before completing this puzzle, it will be stuck where it is. It's imperative for him to confront his sins, as the town has reiterated it him several times by now and will continue to. This puzzle is fairly simple. All James has to do is line up each of the hands with the lines next to their names that were carved into the wall. And James then enters yet another hole. On the other side, we're in the same place the red pyramid thing stood, which is indicated by the red bloodstain. The anomalous creature is nowhere to be seen. The next major room we enter, James walks in on Pyramid Head, violating 2 mannequins. It's a very dark and striking image. This act of sexual violence reflects quite darkly on James, considering how Pyramid Head mirrors who James is. Did James sexually abuse Mary? What has he done or considered? James hides in a nearby closet and simply watches the act in a disgustingly voyeuristic fashion. Perhaps James takes some vicarious joy in his observation. There's, of course, no talking about this scene without talking about its heavy allusions to the scene from the David Lynch movie Blue Velvet, especially as Team Silent have directly cited Lynch's work as major inspiration for these games. In the movie Blue Velvet, the main character hides in a closet and watches as a rape happens in front of him, paralleling the Silent Hill 2 scene. Though in this instance, Pyramid Head and the mannequins are both monsters of the town and creatures without inherent motivation, whereas the people in Lynch's situation are humans. A person committing a disgusting act against another person. The victim is a lounge singer, which is eerily reminiscent of something that we will learn James fetishizes later in the game. I have no other words for this. It's cruel and barbaric, and James's desires are disgusting. It's hard not to start hating him after seeing such a disturbed part of him manifest. After Pyramid Head takes his leave, we get a few more keys and find a pack of canned juice. Canned juice is an interesting choice for an item here. It seems a little childish for James to find. Perhaps this is residual of the little girl that we met earlier in the apartments. Or maybe it's a reference to how childish James is on the inside, the way that he sees the world in extremely simple ways, like women being objects. Perhaps it's an illustration of the dichotomy between nature and machine, the way Silent Hill perverts even the organic by making it packaged and processed. We take this canned juice and immediately throw it into a trash compartment in order to progress. This act of destroying this object of childhood is an interesting piece of symbolism regarding personal growth, and judging by the fact that the old man coin is what we obtain from this action, I like to think it's supposed to be yet another way of symbolizing how the search for truth is a search that is inherently mature. It not only makes you wiser, but also makes you harrowed. The more you learn about yourself, the more the abyss stares into you, and the more you learn to suffer. When we go to pick up the old man coin from the garbage disposal, we find a newspaper clipping about a murder case that happened recently. James has the, tact to refer to this as a gossip page, further indicating the strange dismissiveness he has of the things around him. This paper details the arrest of a man named Walter Sullivan, who murdered 2 twin children and his suicide with a soup spoon. Derived from the Germanic words for someone who commands an army, the name Walter gives us some idea of who he was, a very commanding and overbearing presence. Sullivan, meanwhile, simply means black-eyed one. Black eyes are often associated with the supernatural and also evil, in an unfortunately racist aspect of semiotics. Walter must have been a terrifying man in life, regardless. His 2 victims were named Billy and Miriam Locane. Billy is short for William, a name that means someone who protects, whereas Miriam is a Hebrew name meaning star of the sea. While the 2 were just infants, perhaps the relationship they had was Billy as a protector of Miriam. It's a classic misogynistic setup to have the woman be protected by the man, after all. The surname Locane has the most interesting meaning of all to me. It means hollow. This, of course, refers to how Walter Sullivan left them, hollow husks of people defined only by their victimhood in the murder. The meaning of the Walter Sullivan story in the grander scheme of Silent Hill 2 fascinates me because, on first blush, it seems like a total non sequitur. However, Walter murdered 2 children, 2 links to the past, to innocence. James has just done something similar symbolically with the canned juice. While James uses it to push forward to the truth, Walter commits suicide. What made James's act of moving on from naivete different is that he didn't hurt anyone else in the process, that we know of. Walter uses his killings for some personal reason that I won't really get into because I wouldn't like to defer to Silent Hill 4 too much, but obviously whatever he's dealing with creates more and more victims like him. And the guilt of that led to him literally destroying himself. An old schoolmate of Walter's even said that he wasn't always like this, that he wasn't always someone who might be a killer. The only question that remains is, will James do the same when he's confronted with the truth? When we find out what he's really done? Of course, the most direct plot connection is that Walter spoke of a creature known as the Red Devil who made him commit the murders during his arrest. The game wants you to believe it was the Red Pyramid thing, after all they're both Red Devils, but it's never totally confirmed, and that interpretation is retconned in Silent Hill 4 anyway. However, I will interpret it under that lens for the purposes of this video. Pyramid Head comes to punish those who have done terrible things, so it's obvious why it appeared to Walter Sullivan, one of the most foul murderers around. Though the devil is often evil, there is also a quality of judgment to him found in fictional depictions as well. He is, after all, the ruler of hell, the last place of judgment for many people. Perhaps that's why Pyramid Head is sometimes known this way. Maybe Walter saw his killings as him rebelling against a fate that he was resigned to, judgment for the killings he had already committed. Maybe James also deserves judgment for hurting someone helpless. The newspaper article ends with a note from the aforementioned schoolmate saying that he always thought Walter was crazy, as opposed to him saying earlier that he never suspected Walter to be crazy in the first place. This is a duplicitous answer that shows how easily people can bandwagon on a particular point, which is common in artistic discussion. Silent Hill 2 will continue to go to great lengths to show that there really isn't much different between those society deems regular and those it deems insane, and this is one of the first pieces of evidence of that. The person who directly calls Walter Sullivan insane doesn't even have integrity here. We have access to the courtyard now as well, so James goes there next. Here we can find this apartment complex's swimming pool, which is a familiar sight for many, but completely empty. Another image of the ordinary juxtaposed with the surreal, especially considering there's a baby carriage in the center surrounded by monsters. Imagery of a child betrayed by being abandoned in a place full of creatures that would hurt it. There's a snake coin in this baby carriage, representative of temptation and cunning as snakes are often. The snake parallels a character who we have yet to meet, but the fact that it's in the baby carriage has some interesting symbolism. Being bullied and having to fend for yourself as a child can often leave lasting scars that lead to more hurting. Across the courtyard, we can re-enter the apartments and come across a building where we find a dead body in a refrigerator and hear someone vomiting in the bathroom. Only the dead body's feet show out of the refrigerator, a faceless victim taken by someone, perhaps the person throwing up in the bathroom. When we approach the bathroom, we see a pre-rendered cutscene of the man throwing up in the toilet. This character has an interesting style of dress. He's wearing a striped shirt and shorts that are too small for him, leading his butt to be exposed. He's also wearing a baseball cap. His clothes look much younger than he is. Perhaps he never moved past that point in his life for some reason or another. The vomiting man immediately starts exclaiming that he didn't kill the man who's in the fridge, which is pretty suspicious behavior. The fact that he continues to reiterate this idea throughout this conversation with James doesn't make him look any better. Despite all this, James simply ignores him and introduces himself. Classic James. It's here we learn this character is named Eddie. The etymological meaning of this name is wealthy guardian, perhaps indicating that Eddie comes from a rich background. Maybe a twist on how a guardian is a presumed murderer. Something also interesting is that the team have directly stated that his name was based on Eddie Murphy. Maybe to say that Eddie hasn't been taken seriously throughout most of his life and has been seen as a gag due to that actor's prolific portfolio of starring in comedies. The only real question James asks Eddie of note is if Eddie is associated with Pyramid Head. This is actually the scene where Pyramid Head's official name comes from, the red pyramid thing. Eddie claims he has no idea what Pyramid Head is, even though he also sees the monsters of the town. Perhaps then Pyramid Head only appears to those who have committed a great sin worthy of judgment. You may say Eddie is worthy of judgment for killing someone, but I don't think he actually killed anyone. The corpse is a manifestation of the town. Perhaps he really did find this corpse. Perhaps he killed a monster that took the form of a person. Whatever the case, Eddie is actually innocent at this point in the game's story. Therefore, he is not a victim of Pyramid Head's ire. It's an interesting distinction for the creators to make in a game full of ambiguities. I'm not one to appeal directly to authorial intent when it comes to analysis often, but I find Eddie's story more interesting under this lens myself. Eddie also confirms in this conversation that he's not from Silent Hill. This is the third character we've met who was mysteriously brought to the town by an external factor. James searching for his dead wife, the girl in the cemetery searching for her mother, and now Eddie is here for some reason he doesn't specify. The two exchange goodbyes and James leaves Eddie to his vomiting. Something interesting to talk about during this scene is that the track that plays during it is titled Ordinary Vanity. Eddie is someone who's self-conscious about his appearance, though we're not sure why yet. It's not uncommon to vomit when you see a corpse, of course, but Eddie vomits a comical amount. And to address the title of the song Ordinary Vanity, it's clearly an extension of that idea. Our society pushes certain body standards on us, ones that lead us to do horrible things to our bodies. This is the ordinary vanity, hurting ourselves in order to fit a specific image. The room next to Eddie is covered in football memorabilia and graffiti that's difficult to make out, an indication that Eddie also has a scattered mind and has some connection to football. He's definitely a fan, but I feel like there's more to this story than simply that. There's an almost sad quality to this entire segment of the room. Like broken dreams, this ties into the coin that represents Eddie, the snake, which we found earlier. Eddie was bullied as a child, possibly by football players, out of his depth whenever he tried to engage in physical activity, be that playing football or swimming, simply for his weight. I know that feeling, though the teasing I received was never as severe as what he seems to have. His social development was stunted for this reason. I mean, there has to be a reason he acts so childish and accusatory whenever he talks to someone. He simply doesn't know how. He's trapped in a baby carriage at the bottom of a swimming pool with no tools to fend for himself. In another room in the apartments, we can find a pamphlet that tells us about visiting Silent Hill. Apparently it's a popular tourist attraction known for being tranquil and a great place to clear your head. I'm sure the irony is not lost on you, but this is probably the reason why James and Mary came to the town in the first place all those years ago. The last line of the pamphlet in particular is of interest to me. The memories James and Mary made here certainly have stuck with them, enough for them both to return here for one reason or another. There's a pull the town has, the never-ending battle with trauma those who have suffered from it find themselves locked into. There's nothing more terrifying than the endless cycle of traumatic pain. The man who edited this paper is named Roger Widmark. Roger is a name that means honor etymologically, and the Widmark surname means woodland, which Silent Hill likes to draw from a lot in terms of imagery. Then we are supposed to see Roger as trustworthy, and that the town truly was nice at one point in time. After all, there had to be some reason James and Mary went. Eventually, James leaves the safety of the Woodside apartments and jumps over to the Blue Creek apartments, which are much more spiritual and dangerous. As we discussed earlier, both forests and creeks had magical mythological connotations, but water is inherently more dangerous. Bodies of water are like other worlds you can never visit or truly understand, places where you would be totally alienated if you were stranded in them. At the very least, the residents of a forest look familiar to you and also breathe air. We know less about our planet's oceans than we do about outer space, or so the saying goes. When I say James jumps over to Blue Creek Apartments, by the way, I mean that in a literal sense. James takes a jump from an open door in the Woodside Apartments to an open window in the Blue Creek Apartments, with no real regard for his own life, as per usual. It's also an interesting representation of a crossing over into a more hostile environment. I wouldn't exactly call the Woodside Apartments welcoming, but the Blue Creek Apartments are even less hospitable. It's interesting that there are two apartment buildings. It's another representation of dialectical dichotomy that we see throughout the game. Two apartments, one more dangerous than the other. James enters an apartment that is a bit different than the ones we've seen before, indicating the change in structures. Here we see broken glass on the floor, which shows that the window wasn't truly open. Somebody had broken it in the past. It's a grisly sight to walk in on, and another symbol of James's own fractured mental state. But immediately after walking in here, we get one of the most iconic moments where his mental state is put on full display. He sticks his hand into a disgusting toilet because he sees something in it. It's yet another time James needs to progress through the unknown in order to find the way forward, but I think there's a bit more to this than that. You see, James pulls a wallet out of the toilet. Perhaps this is indicative of how under capitalism nobody can be free from sin. In order to survive, you must dirty your hands and make money. The horrible systemic abuse that we all perpetuate against each other represented by a mere wallet in a toilet. This is further evidenced by the fact that the wallet has a memo to open a nearby safe with a cache of bullets in it. Money leads to conflict, the Ouroboros of capital feeding itself through endless forever wars in the name of business. The Blue Creek apartments have a piece of music that starts playing once you get into them proper, known as Ashes and Ghost. This title is an interesting schism, yet another dichotomy in the game. The ashes are the physical remains of the body, while the ghost is the spiritual. It's also fitting that it plays in apartments that are, too, split down the middle. Silent Hill 2 is dialectical. Silent Hill 2 is the conversation with oneself. The next important room we come across is a dilapidated living room. Here we find teddy bears strewn across the floor, destroyed, and graffiti covering the walls. It's a tragic scene, and if we go into the next room over, we find out what it really means. In an FMV, we find the girl from the graveyard lying in the middle of the floor in this room, holding a knife close to her face and staring at it. All she says when James enters is,
Oh, it's you.
I feel the need to praise Donna Burke's performance again. It's just fantastic. The knife, of course, symbolizes a lot of things, but here it's pretty direct as to what it's supposed to mean. The girl is thinking of hurting herself, a cut from the knife being a physical sensation that brings her out of the emotional pain she's going through. And the room we just went through was about her, similar to the football room about Eddie we encountered earlier. The teddy bear is the broken living room. It's all indicative of this girl's suffering. She's someone who's been through a lot of pain in her childhood, the images of it destroyed in front of her eyes. She never really got to have one. The song playing in this scene is titled Promise Reprise, which is interesting because the non-reprise version of the Promise track has not yet played. This non-chronological usage of the songs is pretty unique and lends to the disorienting feel of Silent Hill. And this is also another reinforcement of this girl's situation. Her situation is told to us non-chronologically. We learn her present before her past. We see the reprise before the prelude. But what does the promise refer to? Is it to find her mother? We'll get back to this later. When we exit the FMV, we see that she is lying in front of a mirror. Another image of dialecticism, the binary existence of Silent Hill 2, a reflection and its originator. Of course, it's also an illustration of her own self-reflection in a pretty heavy-handed way. It's also the way we perceive her, and when we only see her face in the mirror, she speaks only in ways that relate to her own perception of her. Her name, her internalized judgments from other people. It's really powerful. Yet that's not the true her. She's the true her. She doesn't deserve to suffer. She doesn't deserve to take her own life. We learn her name is Angela, which is obviously derived from angel. Angela is a rather angelic character throughout the game, and the more we learn about her tragic life, the easier it is to see her in this light. She deserves her face the least of any of the characters in Silent Hill 2, yet she has the worst of them all. It's heartbreaking, and I'll be talking about it a lot more when we get to that. Her name apparently comes from the protagonist of the film, The Net, which is interesting because the lead character of that film, who she is named for, is much more cold and calculated than Angela is. Maybe it's as a stark contrast to what the character actually is, a reference red herring. James tries to give Angela some frankly pretty weak advice about not killing herself, but she simply reiterates that it's what they both deserve. It's interesting that she specifies that both she and James deserve suicide, almost as if she knows that if he's in the town that he has some fatal guilt that he carries with him. Angela has still not found her mother, and apparently she thought for some reason that she was in this apartment building. This won't be the last time a Silent Hill character thinks their mother is in an apartment they aren't, by the way. Angela's erratic behavior continues in a fashion that's intensely relatable to me as someone with borderline personality disorder. The way she apologizes over and over for things that are really minuscule or extrapolates antagonism from even seemingly minor actions. Takayoshi Sato outdid himself with Angela, just a phenomenal character. James tells Angela about the situation with Mary, and Angela rightfully questions him because, well, Mary is dead. Despite this, she trusts James with the knife before she leaves. She doesn't want to hurt herself with it, though this also represents James realizing that suicide is an option for himself as well. When James tries to take the knife from her, Angela suddenly recoils and brandishes it at him, a clear trauma response. She apologizes profusely and asks him not to hurt her as she leaves the knife on the table and leaves. Something I find quite interesting is that the two people James meets in the town who accompany him on his journey are separated into the two apartments, almost as if to convey that they too are two dialectical aspects of one whole. As is everything in this interestingly split world, there's a schism here. Eddie's trauma is much more physical, while Angela's is much more emotional. Eddie is the ashes, and Angela is the ghost. Now that we can explore the room, if we look on the ground, we can see a photo of a family torn apart. Notably, the father is the one divided away from the others. Angela's reaction to James could be a reaction to men in general coming toward her due to trauma from her father, an eerie juxtaposition with the smiling faces in this photo. Abusers often hide behind sinister veneers of kindness, so it's no wonder that Angela's father does the same. It's simply horrible. We also find the final coin here, the prisoner. Angela herself was a prisoner of her abuse, and now she's a prisoner of her own daily mental suffering. She thinks that in death she can escape, and in some ways she's right, but true freedom will still elude her. Angela's pain is too deep for things to be that simple. She's in the ultimate jail cell of the mind, unable to move on, unable to continue growing. Our next puzzle we come across is a box where we must fit the 3 coins we've obtained from the apartments into 3 separate holes. This too is accentuated by a poem. This poem is largely just a hint on how to solve the puzzle, but it's also interesting in its own right. A biblical parable about the fall of man, the snake coin we know as Eddie tempting the prisoner Angela into the void of sin while the old man James merely watches. It's an interesting comparison to make, James and God. Another interesting choice here is that Angela and Eddie never interact in the game at all, making the biblical parable not apply. In fact, as we'll see, James and Eddie have a relationship more easily compared to Eve and the snake from Eden, respectively. It's a really fascinating poem. To refer to Eve as a prisoner within Eden is a take I haven't ever seen before. This further applies to James and Mary's relationship, even though even this puzzle is supposed to refer to Angela. Maybe, in some ways, Mary felt trapped with James when she was sick. And of course we know the opposite is true. James saw Mary as a burden and himself as a prisoner. Another interesting aspect of this coin puzzle is that Eddie and Angela's coins are always directly next to each other in all puzzle difficulties, whereas James is always separated from them in some way. There is a quality to his suffering that is distinctly different from theirs, but we have yet to know it. Also, James as God is interesting because it's part of a thread where James sees himself worthy to judge others. Perhaps that's something that has to do with what he did. From this we get the line key, which is a name that means soft and gentle, referring to the line root. If we bring this key where it belongs, we can read a memo on the door instead of opening it, addressed to a Tim, written in a soft tone. Tim is a fitting name, since he was the person who was supposed to find the key that we just acquired. And the name means God's honor. He was the one who was supposed to go through that theological exercise we just did. The honor of experiencing the retelling of Eden was for him. The room with the coin puzzle in it is described as belonging to an Uncle David, who is another biblical character known for defeating a giant with only a slingshot. It's fitting that someone from the Old Testament as accomplished as him would be the keeper of the old stories. From here we get another key, and that key brings us to another scene of Pyramid Head doing something unspeakable to a mannequin before he tosses it aside when James arrives. Though he tries to leave, James can't, and Pyramid Head picks up a gigantic version of the knife that Angela gave James and prepares itself for a fight. What's interesting here is that Pyramid Head's great knife only appears after Angela has given James the knife. Pyramid Head couldn't hurt James before, but now that James has a means of committing suicide, Pyramid Head is also weaponized. Another connection between the two. Pyramid Head brings James both closer to death and closer to life, an interesting dichotomy in a game full of them. However powerful this suicidal ideation is, however, it also makes Pyramid Head incredibly easy to avoid. The weight and burden of self-harming thoughts on your mind is represented through how he struggles to even swing them against James. It's a horrible thing to be stuck in something that's hard to escape even through the means that everyone tells you to, leaving you completely emotionally paralyzed. I would know. I've been there before. You just avoid it because it's easier than doing anything else. And that's what James does here. He waits out the intrusive thoughts instead of meaningfully dealing with them. Every shot you take at Pyramid Head merely makes him leave faster as opposed to ending him entirely. Eventually, a bell rings, a loud distraction, and Pyramid Head flees into some nearby water. The thoughts submerge themselves again, and James doesn't give in to them. Yet. He's still attracted to them, though, judging by how the first action he takes after Pyramid Head leaves is to follow in the direction he left in.
Do I look like your girlfriend?
We appear right outside the apartment complex, no closer to finding Mary. Back in the fog of Silent Hill, James goes through a restricted alleyway and eventually comes across the little girl who stepped on his hand in the apartment sitting on top of a wall, her legs dangling playfully. She takes a high ground position over James, a position where judgment of him is seen as justified within the composition of the scene. On the wall is a frankly adorable chalk drawing of a teddy bear and a cat, both a representation of this girl's artistic skills and also her love of both animals. Bears are often seen as protectors, with teddy bears positioned as stuffed toys who defend children against the night. Perhaps this girl sees herself as protecting Mary from James by impeding his progress. Cats are often seen as isolated and lonely creatures, and maybe we'll come to know that this girl is both of those things as well. She is isolated on this wall, after all. The other thing depicted in the drawing are a pair of sunflowers, which are plants that always face towards the sun. Despite the way she treats James, this girl is ultimately optimistic, with bright stars lighting up her pastel art. She and James have a short and adversarial conversation in line with their previous interaction. Here we learn some key things. For starters, this girl doesn't seem to be aware of the monsters in the town. Silent Hill only targets those with significant wounds and protects children, which makes sense considering the supernatural side of the town was partially created by someone who was heavily abused as a child. It's also just an interesting way of displaying the lens of childhood on the world. You can't see the monsters because you don't truly know what they are yet. Or at least, ideally, you don't. But in the case of this particular girl, that ideal seems to hold true. We also find out that she is not the daughter of Mary and James, because James doesn't seem to know who she is. She has her own letter, we don't know what's inside it, but when James tries to get it from her, she runs off. James questions how she knows Mary's name after she says that he never loved Mary. What does she know about James that we don't? I mean, we've already inferred a lot about the horrible things James thought about Mary, but how does this character know them? And what else does she know? Let's get back to that later. James descends once again, down more and more stairs. We arrive now at Rosewater Park, the place James speculated was Mary's special place at the very beginning of the game. The place where James thinks that Mary might be. The park is dead empty, of course, which is a jarring sight for a so-called special place. A strange statue missing its limbs and its head can be found on one side with a plaque that tells you more about its history. The person depicted is named Patrick Chester, a name that refers to a nobleman of a strong fortress, perhaps referencing his staunch defense of the town. Patrick is also the name of the famous Saint Patrick from Catholic mythology, the one who supposedly freed Irish Catholics from an invasive force. This tracks with the plaque's description of the fictional historical figure as someone who bravely defended the town from some invasive force as well, though assumedly instead of Catholicism being protected in this instance, it was the cult that runs the town known only as the Order, which is most likely another instance of the Order plagiarizing other religions. His father was known as Edward, which is also an interesting name as it refers to riches. The Order must come from some amount of wealth if their families are full of noblemen, making it nowhere near as altruistic as it pretends to be. Its greed continues to stain the town, lingering even when people totally unrelated to the cult, such as James, arrive in it. It's by the waterfront that we see a strange woman staring into the water, assumedly at her own reflection, another active schism in the world of Silent Hill 2. This character in general is all about that divide. She has an interesting outfit, a pink leopard print skirt and collar with a red jacket thrown on, exposing her bare midriff. Her hair is blonde, dyed with pink tips, pink and red being colors often associated with attraction and affection. Something I've always appreciated about this character's design is how she is sexualized, but she still looks like a normal person. She's got a bit of a tummy and her face is really tired. As opposed to the average video game hypersexualized boob demons we're accustomed to today, she's rather realistic. There are some other aspects of her outfit that will come into play in just a bit that I would like to touch on then, most notably the butterfly tattoo on her stomach. Interestingly, James mistakes her for Mary at first. Apparently they look quite similar, which is hard to tell ourselves because we have yet to see Mary in motion in this game. They definitely do sound similar though. Her Her name is Maria, a derivative of Mary. She's in many ways everything James saw Mary as lacking in. She's sexually promiscuous, flirtatious, and honestly, really funny. She's a really charming character, and here is the biggest point of Rascal within Silent Hill 2, the Mary and Maria schism. Mary is what James actually had, and Maria is what James thinks Mary should have been like. Maria is to Mary what Pyramid Head is to James. A reflection created by Silent Hill. This is even reflected in her butterfly tattoo. Mary is a moth, plain and ordinary, as well as being someone who passed away, which is interesting because moths are often messengers of death in many cultural contexts. In contrast with Mary, Maria is a beautiful butterfly. Both are symbols of rebirth through metamorphosis as well. Mary was reborn through Maria, though in a way that's different than she ever was in life. In some ways, Maria is also a Christ-like figure. We will see this more later in the text, but she is quite literally the Immaculate Conception of the town and the Virgin Mary. Something else interesting to note is that Maria's outfit is based on Christina Aguilera's from the Nickelodeon Kids' Choice Awards in 1999. This is a really bizarre choice, but I think it makes sense. Culturally speaking, our capitalist society fetishizes youth, so it makes sense that someone so embroiled in it uncritically as James would associate clothes that younger people wear being put on older people with sexuality. He, much like everyone else, is beholden to the misogynistic and pedophilic systems that govern our lives, and so his tastes are determined by aspects of that. The song that plays in the scene is simply titled Null Moon. In many cultures, the moon is associated with femininity, the female counterpart to the sun. This may indicate Maria's non-existence outside of James. She is the null moon. She's also the moon in comparison to Mary. While Mary is nurturing and motherly, much like how a sun is, Maria is quote-unquote darker and more mysterious. She's a little cold to James, despite how she says she's warm. It's really fascinating to me how granular these connections go. James tells Maria that he's trying to find his dead wife, and obviously she responds with skepticism considering, well, he just told her his wife is dead. Rosewater isn't where Mary is, so she asks James if the two of them had another special place. We see a quick full-motion video of Mary in a hotel room, completely silhouetted against blinding light as if on an old VHS tape recording. The way the light shines from behind her frames her once more as an angel. We'll be seeing this again at some point. It's pretty important, I think. We also see her start coughing. Maybe she contracted her illness while they were in Silent Hill together. It's this memory that makes him remember the Lakeview Hotel, another possible contender for their special place. Maria makes a sexual joke about it, which prompts James to try to leave immediately. It's interesting that someone as sexually objectifying as him doesn't respond well to this joke, perhaps a further indication of how little he wants people to see him that way. Maria begs to come with James, showing the first of a side of her we will continue to see throughout the work. She wants badly for James to pay attention to her, and she wants companionship in a really tragic way. She's interesting as a creation of the town. She has more interiority than most of them do. She'll tag along with us for a bit. Now that we can explore this area a bit better, you may notice there's a lot less water in the lake than you would expect. Perhaps this is the truth of the situation. Toluca Lake is falling on hard times, whether it be through supernatural means or otherwise, but James didn't remember that way, so earlier in the game it simply didn't appear to us that way. The arrival of Maria has changed something, though. He's starting to remember the truth of the situation. An interesting statue we can come across in the park that has no description we can read is of two men shaking hands but missing their heads. I mean, James is losing his mind, right? In all seriousness, this is a pretty direct reference to Maria. James just met someone new, which is usually accentuated by a handshake, but she looks just like his late wife. Her appearance is blurred to him, only resembling a faint memory. It's fascinating. Another monument here describes the deaths of those who succumbed to a fatal illness and were buried beneath the lake. First of all, this continues the idea of the lake itself being a magical place. They bury their dead here. Lakes and bodies of water are often depicted as portals to the realms of the dead. Think of the old Japanese story of the spider's thread in Buddha. Buddha peers into the plane of Naraka through a puddle, which is a plane most analogous to hell. Reflections are simply an ethereal idea. Of course, another big thing to note about this monument is that it mentions an illness. Maybe this is the disease Mary had, and maybe she's one of the 67 who sleep beneath the lake. On our way out of the park, we come across a statue of a woman in a robe, a holy image semiotically. However, the etchings on the statue tell us a different story. This woman was burned at the stake by the Christians as she was a member of the order in the 1700s. Her name, Jennifer, derives from Guinevere, as in the character from King Arthur's Legendarium. I find this quite interesting because it represents both sides of the character in Silent Hill as well. There's the side the Order wants us to see, that is, Arthurian legends of Guinevere being a holy and kind figure, and the underbelly of the abuse she perpetuated as all the members of the Order do, which represents stories where Guinevere is nefarious and traitorous to the protagonists. A common theme and archetype in the Legendarium due to misogyny. It's another example of a schism as well. When people say the cult stuff isn't relevant to Silent Hill 2 analysis, I simply have to disagree. I find connections like this fascinating. In addition, the name Carol simply means a free person. The statue speaks of Jennifer as a martyr. Her freedom was found in death. It's interesting because the game empathizes with this idea. After all, it sees Eve taking the gift of knowledge from the Tree of Life and being cast from the Garden of Eden aspirational. The entity behind the town of Silent Hill ultimately sees the self-determination of women as a good thing, regardless of the actions that they're taking. Considering how the person who made this town what it currently is was a girl who had no agency of her own, only a tool for her mother and her religion, this makes sense, though it's ironic that it also defends the same religion that oppressed her. Even the other Carol that this could be referring to as a name choice, Lewis Carroll, who we spoke of earlier, ties into this. His stories about Alice are about a scared little girl finding her own freedom through the dangers of the absurdity of adult life. Regardless even of any outside context though, Silent Hill is some of the most empathetic text when it comes to abuse of women that I've ever seen. Which we'll touch more on later, but I think this is a subtle reinforcement of its stance on that. While we travel through the town of Silent Hill with Maria in tow, there's a strong chance that you could find a single lonely doghouse sitting by itself. There is nothing else in this little area to fixate on, so it makes me wonder what the purpose of it is. I think each of the people in Silent Hill, though, feels alone in this same way. They're all away from their homes, leaving them empty, and they're all by themselves. James may have Maria's companionship for the moment, but she's still a creation of the town itself. Nobody here who has come to the town actually lives here at all. They're just wandering. While at a gas station, James finds a steel pipe jutting out of a still smoking car. This imagery is pretty evocative, and I think it's pretty straightforward as well. When people who are broken try to find help, the systems that oppress us beat them down even further than they already have. By the time we reach the gas station to refuel, we're already so battered and broken that it's almost impossible to even be able to refuel anymore. When we arrive at Pete's Bolorama, which has been marked on our map for a bit if you'll remember, Maria will wait outside. There's some interesting stuff going on here with this, how she doesn't want to be seen by other people, which indicates that she probably can't be seen by other people. But more importantly, Mary probably hates bowling if Maria does. I can't believe it. Maybe she isn't such an angelic figure after all. But in seriousness, it's interesting to imagine the two of them having an argument over something so minuscule. It seems like there were a lot of minor points of friction that James chooses to fixate on and linger on. Maybe he feels guilt over this, like it somehow contributed to Mary's death. Maybe he should feel guilt for it. When we enter the bowling alley after a brief decrepit transition area, we are thrust into a conversation between Eddie and the little girl from the apartments who we keep seeing. James is nowhere to be seen for now. Eddie is eating some pizza, which is an interesting detail. This is the only time in the Team Silent created Silent Hill games we see someone eating food. I'm not sure about any of the ones after 4, seeing as I haven't played them, but food must be a great fixation for Eddie for it to show up in the town at all. It's kind of an interesting detail that our second meeting with Eddie is in a bowling alley. Though it's possible that James also likes bowling, as I discussed earlier, I think it's much more Eddie's choice of sport. Eddie is someone who is interested in sports, but is often made fun of for his lack of physical fitness ability. However, bowling would be a sport where his weight isn't much of a factor. It's not as physically extraneous, so there are less opportunities for him to be made fun of. That's probably the reason why it's here, and why it's the only sport we actually get to see him hanging out around. It's the only sport he has truly fond memories of. The little girl proceeds to make fun of Eddie for his weight and grills him on what crimes he might have committed. She's really just kind of an asshole here, and I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe we'll find out why she's so volatile later. We do learn that Eddie is running from something though, which makes sense, and it's probably how he ended up in Silent Hill in the first place. Eddie tends to run from conflict, as we have seen. The second he might have had a confrontation with James in the apartments, he immediately went to deflection. I'm sure we'll learn more about it as we continue. The music that plays in this area is titled Alone in the Town. At this point in the game, Maria isn't following you, so James once again has to contend with being alone with his thoughts. Though there are many points in the game where a song titled this could apply, this is the most fitting in my opinion. We've just had a companion for around 10 minutes, and adjusting to being suddenly alone again is probably pretty jarring. Also, it could indicate that James has no true friends in the town, even Maria. Eddie is afraid of him for one reason or another, Maria is often mysterious and cold, and the little girl is, well, she just hates James, which is kind of based. Which is another great contrast. Even though we just got Maria in our party to follow us, James still doesn't have true companionship, which adds yet another twinge of tragedy to Maria as a character. He doesn't see her as a person, and neither does the narrative, even though she wishes they would. In an interesting choice, the room James enters after this cutscene plays out is not the one that we just saw. Instead, it's another room of the lobby, an intermediary room. There's a sense of distance from these other characters created by this choice, and more time for James to linger in his thoughts. James can hear what their conversation's about without taking action. A passive observer, much like the player themselves. With that being said, there's not much else to say about the contents of this room other than it being totally disheveled, which is of course the through line of the whole town. We do hear one quick detail about the little girl as the conversation continues here. She is also searching for Mary. This only solidifies her connection to Mary further and also makes her, in some ways, similar to James. They are both looking for Mary in this town, and both seem to be following similar clues to find her. Despite her distaste for James, perhaps this little girl has more in common with him than she thinks. Upon entering the bowling alley proper, James talks to Eddie, who is considerably calmer now in the presence of food. Food is, of course, his personal way of coping with his issues. The little girl from before is nowhere to be seen, and when James asks Eddie about her, she runs out the door. Of course, she leaves with the first sight of James. Their adversarial relationship continues to be mysterious. It's here we learn that the little girl is actually named Laura, which is a very interesting choice. There's a lot going on here. The name Laura itself has roots in the laurel plant, which are often associated with victory. I don't think there's really anything victorious about Laura that we know of yet, though. Perhaps it's an ironic contrast with who she is, someone who is clearly defeated and alone. However, the other big meaning behind Laura's name comes from Richard D'Ambrosio's novel No Language But a Cry, which is an autobiographical story about an abused child who can't speak due to her severe trauma. While Laura can literally speak, she isn't really able to communicate her needs effectively to those around her. Instead of telling James why she's upset with him or even working with him to find Mary, she lashes out at both him and Eddie. Granted, there are also probably other reasons why she distrusts James. James doesn't seem like a very good person, and Laura seems to know something about that somehow, but we'll get to that when it comes up. Something else to discuss regarding Laura is that the main theme of the game is named for her. The one that I mentioned Yamaoka wrote in like a week at the beginning of the video. It's titled Theme of Laura, but that naming scheme seems completely random on a first glance. The song is never directly associated with her in the game. However, I think the reason why this is the case is because Laura is who would be the protagonist in a more traditional narrative. She has the same hurt as James. She lost Mary, though we don't know how much that means to her yet, but she's a much better person than he is. In a conventional and straightforward video game about exploring the town to find answers about a lost loved one, I would more easily see her as the playable lead. Or maybe the song is named for her because Laura's judgment is so integral to James. We've seen her acting as his judge several times already, and will several times more. If the game is about James's judgment, then Laura would naturally take center stage. Though Pyramid Head represents judgment in many ways, he is not a judge himself, simply an executioner. Laura is the one who gives the order, even though she doesn't truly realize it. When James confronts Eddie about letting Laura go off on her own, Eddie deflects by saying that she said herself that he would just be dead weight. Eddie's own self-pity and trauma is now preventing him from doing the right thing. He's giving into intrusive thoughts and his own distorted self-perceptions. Though Laura bullies Eddie about his weight, Eddie isn't actually useless, and it would be much more fitting for him to be with Laura than her on her own in an empty and dangerous nightmare town. But he's so convinced he can't help that he'll look for any excuse out of it, even baseless insults. It's a place that I've been before, so I understand. I think that Eddie is often an overlooked character in these kinds of analysis of the game, and while I can't say I find him more compelling than literally any of the other characters, I will say he's astonishingly well written, just like everything else about this game. He's yet another facet that makes up the incredible whole of Silent Hill 2. When we go after Laura after exiting the bowling alley, we find Maria out of breath. She says she saw Laura running behind the bowling alley, but she was too fast for her. I'm not entirely sure what this means. Laura and Maria clearly have a special bond, especially considering how Maria clearly has the same maternal worry for Laura that Mary assumedly had, but whether or not Laura knows Maria exists is up for debate. A lot of people cite this as a reason Laura doesn't exist outside of James, and is an invention of James's mind similar to Maria. Frankly, I don't find assuming Laura isn't real outside of James all that interesting, and find that it detracts a lot from the overall narrative of the game, but we'll get more into that later. We come to a dead end in an alleyway, and Maria claims that Laura went through a small gap between two buildings that adults can't fit through. This is a pretty subtle way of indicating that because Laura has a much more naturally innocent outlook on life, she is able to see things about Silent Hill that James and Maria can't. Paths are open to her that they cannot take. It's more wondrous than terrifying for her, an even more apt comparison to Alice than Alessa was in the first game. She's crossed over the looking glass into her own wonderland, but unlike Alessa's, it's just as magical as Alice's. Luckily, we can get around this building as well by simply going through it. Maria has the key to it. While she gets it out of her clothes and uses it to open the door, James tries to peek at her butt. I don't think I have to reiterate how much of a dick James is to women. Inside the building, we first go through a short hallway full of trash before entering the building proper. It's here that we encounter one of the most fascinating lines about James that is tucked away in the game and sort of hidden.
Liquor bottles. I don't need that right now. It's not that I don't drink. In fact, I drink a fair bit. To get away from the pain, the loneliness. But the drinking never changes anything. Anyway, I don't need it now. There's something that I have to do.
It's an interesting moment for a multitude of reasons. Obviously, it confirms our suspicion that James frequently drinks in order to escape his feelings about Mary's death and his ensuing isolation afterward. However, it's also interesting because it's one of the few times in the game where James talks directly to us. There's something about alcohol that makes him feel more vulnerable, and we get a much clearer idea of who he is from this because he's directly explaining it to us. There is no ambiguity in his statements. Perhaps James is blunt when drunk. When we enter the room at the end of the hallway, we find out a few things. This place is Heaven's Night, the place that we learned of in the advertisement at the beginning of the game and we also saw on the map. True to its name, however, is that it's also a strip club. The so-called Dark Side of Heaven. Surprisingly, this is one of the best maintained locations in the game, with it not being nearly as decrepit as the bowling alley for comparison. Perhaps this is because James has idealized fantasies of these locations, places where he can go in order to fulfill his desires. With that being said, he still needs Maria's help to enter the building, showing his shame. It's not something that he can do by himself. He feels as if he needs his wife or a stand-in for her to tell him that it's okay first. Which is a totally normal thing to do. You should make sure if your partners are okay with you engaging in the sex work industry before you do, though obviously Maria isn't actually Mary. However, James's fixation on it, along with his intense shame surrounding that fixation, clearly isn't healthy. Something else interesting to note about Heaven's Night is that despite Maria working here, she doesn't say anything while she's in this location. It's pretty simple. The sex work industry treats those who are a part of it as objects, as all industry under capitalism does. Sex work is work, and work in a capitalist society is inherently objectifying and exploitative. It's no wonder then that when at her place of labor, Maria is at her quietest. She is not a person here, she is a tool to be gazed at. Also, not to cite later games too much, but there is a song on Silent Hill 4's soundtrack that implies that Maria was a singer at Heaven's Night. This song is performed live at the venue according to the title, and is directly about the relationship between James and Mary, which ties into another relationship in Silent Hill 4. The song is sung by Mary Elizabeth McGlynn, who shares a name with Mary and also plays Mary and Maria in the awful HD re-release that I feel dirty for mentioning. I think it's pretty clear that Maria is a singer then, which makes the connections to Lynch's work more apparent to me. In Blue Velvet, the film we mentioned earlier with the scene where James was in the closet, the protagonist has an affair with a lounge singer, which is similar to what's going on here. Sure, Mary is probably dead, so it's not really an affair, but he is still using Maria as a replacement for Mary. If Mary is Silent Heaven, then Maria is Heaven's Night. Their dichotomy emphasized once more. Just outside of Heaven's Night, we come to the front steps of a hospital. The significance of such a location to James is pretty obvious. It's where Mary assumedly spent her last days. It's a place of great emotional trauma for James and possibly also Maria. We don't actually know how much of Mary she has in her yet. The hospital itself is called Brookhaven, which is a name that invokes a calm feeling. A brook is a small kind of stream that just sounds nice to say and brings to mind peaceful woodlands, and a haven is a safe place to rest for a while. Of course, since these are in a monster-infested town called Silent Hill, you can probably hazard a guess that these are absolutely misnomers. However, they were misnomers even before the town became haunted. Hospitals are not calming places. They are nightmares of capital, where human life is attributed to monetary value in the most direct way possible. Lives are nothing but a cost on them, not something to be treasured. With that in mind, let's see its horrors firsthand.
All you care about is that dead wife of yours!
The first thing that we can grab here is the map of the hospital on the wall at the front. The fact that immediately James knows the layout of this place is pretty telling to me. Granted, I doubt Mary was staying at a hospital in Silent Hill, for obvious reasons, but this town is shaped by the thoughts and experiences of the people within it, not a constant. Though some of the later games would change that, which frustrates me, the point is, he knows what hospitals are like. One of the rooms we can enter here is the secretary's office. On the desk here, next to the ever-ominous save point, we can find a clipboard listing the patients. Something you'll notice as we read about these patients is that they aren't typical hospital patients. This is a mental hospital. Why this appeared to James instead of a regular hospital is due to the fact that he thinks Mary should be institutionalized or something. He conflates her hospital stay with her being condemned into a psychiatric ward. He sees her lying sick and dying and thinks of her in a straitjacket. The name of the hospital is Brookhaven, an echo of the irony of most mental institutions, which are often named after calm ideas but have realities far worse. The first patient in this note is Jack Davis. Jack is a name derived from the biblical John, as in John the Baptist. His last name Davis also means son of David, which is most likely referring to Solomon, who took over as king of Jerusalem after David's death. John and David in particular are both known for being particularly devout followers of God's teachings in the Bible, and Jack Davis, despite his constant suicidal outbreaks, was an ideal patient, thus following the teachings of the hospital as God in this scenario. Joseph Barkin is the next patient. Joseph is most likely in reference to Mary's husband Joseph, as opposed to the character Joseph from the book of Genesis, who is far less well known. It's a really interesting connection because Joseph Barkin sees himself as responsible for the death of his daughter, even though he wasn't. Though Joseph is often portrayed as having died before Jesus did, since he was never mentioned in the New Testament beyond Jesus' childhood, one might imagine he would feel the same way about his son's infamous death. I mean, my son having arguably the most famous death in the Western literary canon would make me feel guilty too. Presumably our Christ in this version of the parable is a woman because Silent Hill is such a female-centric story, at least in the case of the teen silent pieces, much like how Maria and Laura often take the role of Christ as well. As for the last name Barkin, I would assume it's because of his psychotic quote-unquote delusions. Barkin is a Turkish name that refers to the act of viewing, and Joseph is certainly viewing the true nature of the town as opposed to any psychotic delusion. Maybe it also refers back to the Bible in this way. Many would say that Joseph meeting the angel Gabriel was probably a delusion. I mean, personally, I think it was just a story that was made up, but if we're taking it at face value, then a lot of people might explain it away that way. Are the monsters of Silent Hill not like angels in some ways? Forces such as Pyramid Head only act on divine judgment, not malice. Our final patient, Joshua Lewis, seems to call back to the biblical Joshua who was the right hand of Moses in Exodus. This Joshua seems to be quick to solve problems through violence, which while not a distinct character trait of the biblical Joshua that is mentioned, is something one can infer from how he conquered Canaan. The surname Lewis simply refers more to this tendency toward conflict. It's an anglicized version of the German name Ludwig, referring to a great battle. Each one of these patients also refers to one of the three main characters of this game who are going through the town, as many sets of three in this game do. Jack Davis is Angela, quiet and polite. She's often prone to suicidal ideation, as we have seen with her fixation on the knife James currently has in his possession, but she's ultimately a person who does her best to stay out of trouble to a concerning degree. She is extremely fearful. James is Joseph, both as the husband of Mary in a pretty direct biblical connection, but also as someone who feels guilt over the loss of someone. Again, James likely blames himself for Mary's death, as anyone does when they lose a loved one. Finally, there's Eddie. We haven't seen him as prone to violence yet, but he is prone to being accusatory and starting arguments only to cower at the first sense of any pushback. It's interesting how the town has brought these three together, a dichotomy with an outlier in it, James. In a room behind this one, we can find a single desk with a typewriter and some notes next to it. The notes written next to the typewriter describe some kind of illness written by a doctor. It's clear from these writings that some of the patients had seen the other world, though as psychologists, the doctor takes it as a mental illness as opposed to actually crossing over into this spiritual other world. There's a surprising amount of empathy in this passage regardless, showing that broken systems perpetuate abuse even when those acting them are acting in good faith. Something else interesting to note is that at the end this person says that the person is extremely happy in the other world, the so-called delusion. From everything we've seen of the other world from the first Silent Hill game, it's pretty unpleasant, though it's not stated who this is referring to, judging by his presence later in the note and the fact that he is the one who suffers from the delusions. This must be the aforementioned Joseph Barkin. Perhaps Joseph's virtuous nature, seeing as he is the Joseph of the New Testament, is what allows him to see the other world as a much gentler place. Then that's a stark contrast to James. James has committed some traumatic sin that leads his other world to look like a nightmare. It's from this note that we acquire a key with a purple bowl drawn on it, which was supposedly in Joseph's possession. This is an interesting combination of ideas, purple and a bowl. Purple is a color highly associated with royalty. As the man who raised a Christ analog, this makes sense. However, a bowl is someone prone to stubbornness and patterns of anger. While we don't know the Joseph of Silent Hill to be like that, perhaps he was under the surface of his God-fearing ways. And I think it's more than likely that James himself has some deep-seated anger that we have yet to see. He clearly holds a lot of resentment towards Mary for her illness. On the second floor of the hospital, we encounter the unique enemy of this area, the nurses. We had nurses in the first Silent Hill game, but these ones are different. Namely, their cleavage is showing and they have no faces. This is one of the most obvious pieces representing James's sexual urges in the game. When going to visit Mary, he would ogle the nurses and fantasize about them, which is incredibly disgusting for multiple reasons that I'm sure I don't really have to explain to you. Also, they carry lead pipes in this iteration, which they use as weapons. This is possibly a reference to how lead has been used throughout history as a means of treating illnesses, even though it only makes things worse due to it being poisonous. Or it could be a reference to the blunt nature of Mary's death, how even though James was surrounded by women he found beautiful, the hospital was still a cold smack in the face for him. The song that plays throughout the hospital is also of particular note. The darkness that lurks in our minds is what it's called, and that's a pretty direct reference to what the mental hospital is, a place where we see the darkest aspects of people's minds. It's also, however, a fitting description of the town on the whole. Silent Hill shows people their worst sides. The most interesting thing, though, is that the hospital was where James's mind was probably at its darkest. It was where his dying wife, who he resented, was, and it's where he was checking out other women. James is a terrible person. This place arguably highlights him at his worst in his day-to-day life. If we go to the men's locker room, we find that it's not very well kept at all. There's a poster of a swimsuit model in one of the lockers which James claims is stupid, and a magazine on the table which he thinks won't be of interest to him. While the contents of the magazine are never confirmed and we don't really get a good look at the cover, I assume due to the interaction with the swimsuit model poster in the same room that it's also something pornographic in nature. James's protest to his enjoyment of this material is honestly kind of comical. There's so much shame he has here for his investment in this, and it's not from any nuanced critique of the sex industry on his part or anything. He just knows that Mary would not have approved of his proclivities, or at least assumes that, and therefore acts as if they don't exist instead of confronting them. I find it interesting that the hospital is such a place of great sexual tension for James. The nurses in this room, as well as a few things that'll come up later, all indicate to me that James directly associates the hospital with his own sexual fantasies. Was it because of his closeness to Mary while there, in spite of them not being able to act on that closeness? Was it really just him being that skeevy about the nurses? I feel as if both could be true simultaneously. It's also interesting that Maria has nothing to say about the way James looks at these women. While I can't say for certain how Mary would have felt about it, we aren't given much insight into her thoughts directly in the game, I can say that this is perhaps how James wishes Mary would feel. Someone who looks pretty and stands by while James does whatever he wants with other people and their bodies. There's nothing wrong with indulging in pornography even in a committed relationship, besides the inherent exploitative nature of indulging in any work under capital, but c'est la vie. But considering how James feels about all this, I can assume Mary was not okay with this occurring, which is where the true boundary is. If you're in a relationship and your partner sets a boundary regarding this, then following it is being a good partner. The more the game draws on, the less we see that James was one. We find the key to the examination room in a lab coat hanging on the side of a locker here. I mean, it's obviously called the examination room because it's an examination room, but I also think this key being here is a pretty obvious and simple way of saying that James needs to stop getting distracted by swimsuit posters and start examining himself more seriously. He can't keep using these distractions to get away from who he is. In the women's locker room, sitting on a desk, we find a teddy bear. Perhaps its placement here is in reference to Laura, the girl we're trying to find. Maybe it's even her teddy bear. It's a sign of innocence. Something that's much more interesting about this sign of innocence is that when James tries to touch it, it pricks him. Not only is Laura someone who's, well, literally quite prickly to James, this also represents him as being sinful in some way. He is damaged by things that represent innocence. If we turn our minds back to the bear that Laura drew on the wall outside the apartments, this is also a symbol of protection. Laura is protecting Mary from James, but we still don't know why. Or we do know why, and we just don't know how she knows what James has done. It's from this interaction that James gets a bent and rusty needle, which he decides to keep for some reason. Laura, at her core, must have some amount of trauma that led her to be the way she is, even though it doesn't manifest in Silent Hill as monsters. She's aged more than she should have for a child, much like Angela, which leads to her being perceived as rusty, and her demeanor is bent out of shape. We also find the shotgun here. While not typically a weapon used for self-defense, it's most likely symbolic of how women have to protect themselves more than men when it comes to work. Women are just the target of more harassment and abuse, which would lead to more need for firearms and self-defense, though again, a shotgun is typically not used as a weapon for self-defense. Maybe James, in his misogynistic entitled temper, thinks that women overreact to being harassed, and so assumes that they carry shotguns with them. Considering how generally reactionary we know him to be, I wouldn't be surprised. In one of the rooms where a patient was staying, we can find a typewriter with carbon paper stuck in it. Carbon paper is a symbol of trickery. This piece of carbon paper, though, is simply helpful as opposed to harmful. It provides us with the code for a box. The rest of the note seems to be ramblings about how this code can't help some other third party anymore and how the writer has lost an idea of who they were. Perhaps they were a simple copy created by carbon paper. Earlier, when we found the ball key, we learned that Joseph Barkin had some sort of a code to open a box. Perhaps this note was Joseph losing a part of himself. Maybe James is slowly losing himself as well. Swimming in an ocean created of your own self is not a great place for understanding what defines you. In another patient's room, we can find a key known as the Lapis Eye. In the weird lore of birthstones, lapis lazuli is often associated with the idea of finding your true self and prioritizing your own mental health to find authenticity, I guess, I don't know. So with this being connected to an eye, this is probably a means of indicating that this key will bring James closer to the truth, to seeing what he really is beyond all the cacophony and noise within his head. When we finally end up going to the examination room, if we look at the shelf to our left upon entering, we can see that the lab results are completely open with nothing stopping you from reading them. Commentary on the careless nature of the mental health industry aside, this interaction is really interesting. James reads one of the files here that describes the lab results of a personality disorder test. The choice of test is probably because James attributes Mary with some kind of mental illness. Maybe she had some cluster B tendencies, translation awesome tendencies. The best part, though, is that James refuses to read the lab results. We don't know why, but one can assume it's because they make him upset. He's clearly still affected by the lab results he had to read for Mary's illness. The doctor's lounge next to the examination room, contrary to everywhere else in the hospital, is fairly well maintained, which is pretty directly telling us where the priorities of the systems of the industry lie. The people who actually live in the hospital are given prisoners' cells, while the doctors here have a nice lounge office. Here we find the door code for another wing of the hospital written down on a whiteboard, but the imagery of such a nice room juxtaposed with the rest of the hospital is much more interesting to me. There's something else of interest here. There's a note on the fridge that merely reads,
"Food only. Do not store drugs,"
which indicates something pretty foul. There are two interpretations I can read this under. 1. The mental health industry is so stressful to work in that the people who work in it have to take drugs in order to cope, or 2. That they're stealing drugs from the patients. Maybe it's both. In spite of the break room accommodations appearing nice on the outside, the people who work here are in hell as well. The system also does not care about them, even if it prioritizes them to the patients. Now that we have the code to the patient wing hall, we can enter there. The first room that we go into, Maria goes into a coughing fit and sits down on the bed. The illness that Mary got when she visited Silent Hill is starting to spread back to Maria now. James can never pretend his wife didn't die. Even an ideal replication of her has that one fatal aspect. She claims it's just a hangover, but the early stages of Mary's disease were pretty distinctly demarcated by coughing fits. Something else interesting is the pill she takes after this. It's marked as white on the bottle, which means she may be a PTV addict, which was a drug that took up a big part of the first game's narrative, better known as White Claudia. Regardless of that uninteresting lore connection, though, it's a pretty clear indicator of how the drug industry takes advantage of the sex work industry. Recreationally taking drugs is something that I take no objection to, but I think the way that the drug industry takes advantage of people in poverty is pretty unequivocally a bad thing. Not all sex workers are impoverished, but many are. Silent Hill 2 is very interested in victims of systems of abuse and is extremely empathetic to all of them, a trait which I admire. James tells Maria to rest, which is probably the nicest thing James has ever said to her at this point, and Maria tries to get him to lie down with her by saying how comfortable the hospital bed is. As someone who has stayed in a hospital beds are not comfortable. Her ass is lying. James rebukes her advances by saying he's going to go look for Laura, and if we stay here we can see some extra dialogue. Maria asks James if he knows what he's going to do if he can't find Mary, and he can't answer her. It seems like he has no real goals in his life aside from a strange abstraction of an idea. On the roof of the hospital there's a journal we can read on the floor. In it are the experiences of Jack Davis, but from the way he writes they seem to apply more to Mary than Angela. The way he describes his experiences trapped in the hospital and watching the rain outside fall on the ground screamed me as something Mary would be thinking about as she eked out her last days in a different hospital. Perhaps it's how James understood her, and perhaps this is his guilt manifest in written word. It also can apply to Angela in the sense that she feels trapped in her own mind, just watching everything go by, feeling like she has no control over her own future. Again, I've been there, so I understand. We know Angela harbors a strong amount of self-loathing, so it would make sense that she might feel that she's pathetic and weak and not worth saving. It's an interesting way to communicate that to us, a diary being a place of reflection, but instead of through Angela's thoughts, it's the thoughts of someone we associate with her. While the note about the drugs making her a different person doesn't seem to apply much to Angela, it does speak to a wider philosophical issue with mental health medicine that I've always found fascinating. Is the self really the self when so highly medicated? Mental health medication exists to remove the parts of ourselves that are undesirable for the systems that we live in. The ending of the journal makes it clear that it's a suicide note, further continuing Angela's representation of suicidality. Whoever wrote this ended up jumping off of the roof, though James seems to not register this. Like, all he thinks is, wow, it's weird there was a journal up here. Maybe this is also James's own suicidality that we have seen through Pyramid Head before manifesting, and his reaction to this diary is a form of denial combined with his one-track mindset about finding his deceased wife. This suicidality is also demonstrated moments later when Pyramid Head suddenly appears, only indicated prior by the dreadful scraping of the great knife we can hear across the ground, and throws James off the edge of the hospital roof into another part of the hospital we couldn't access before, the special treatment room. It was perhaps because of all the suicidal thoughts James was thinking through just now that he got put in here. On the wall in this room we can read a memo that merely says that Joseph's allowed to be let out of his cell if he seems calm. This is probably in reference to how James seems calm most of the time that we see him, even though there's obviously more than that going on underneath the surface. He's very good at masking what he's thinking, even to himself. If we enter the padded cell this note is attached to, we can find writing on the wall in blood from Joseph. It's interesting to note that Joseph's writing is full of misspellings, perhaps an indication of James not being able to communicate things very well. While the numbers that he's written down are just a code that he doesn't want to forget, it's interesting that he refers to a secret name of his. Much like James, he has a duplicitous other side to him to hide, another aspect of Raskolnikov's duality present within this tale. On the third floor, a room that I skimmed over earlier now becomes more clear. This was where Joseph stayed, characterized by the bloody handwriting and misspellings present within it. Next to it is the box that the code is for, hiding some secret of his. However, written in blood on the wall, we can see the name of his daughter, Louise. He promises that he can still take care of her, but as we know, she's already dead. The similarities to James are even more apparent. Louise's name is similar to Louis in that it's of Old German origin and similarly refers to warriors. This is another connection to James then. Louise must have battled with some illness just as Mary did. Maybe it was even the same one, considering they're both in Silent Hill. The purple ball and the lapis eye are required to see through to the truth of the situation here and enter the box, the ball being associated with Joseph as with James, and the lapis eye naturally being used to see truths. When we open the box, though, all we find are a few strands of hair. It's pretty clear that this was whatever was left of Louise's hair after her battle with her illness took her, and Joseph treasured it. At least James had a photo. Regardless of the sentimental value of the hair, James takes it. If we head to the shower room, we can find the drain in the center of the room is surrounded by a fluorescent green ooze of some kind. This doesn't exactly engender confidence in us that this place is sanitary, which is true of a lot of mental hospitals. James tries to reach into the drainage pipe because he has no concern for his own health, and we realize that his hand is too large to reach inside. Another example of a flaw in James' approach and mindset to what he's doing here. He has to combine two objects that represent women in his life who he has hurt in some way, the bent needle for Laura and Louise's hair for Mary, in order to reach into the drainage pipe and get what it is out of there. Otherwise he lacks the understanding that he needs in order to come closer to understanding the truth. and closer to the truth James gets. It's through this that we gain the key to the elevator, which will allow him to descend to the first floor from a different perspective. It's on this first floor that we find Laura, finally, amidst a bunch of stuffed toy bears. The song that plays here is The Day is Night, which creates an interesting contrast between James and Laura. As I mentioned before, in many cultures the sun represents man and the moon represents woman, and here we see the two juxtaposed. However, I think that in this situation their roles are reversed. James is the dark moon while Laura is the bright sun. She sees the future that James doesn't. She sees the day that hides in the night, whereas James refuses to even see the night. Two people hurt by the death of Mary, one stuck in memories of her and one moving on with her life. Here we have another adversarial conversation between James and Laura where James tries to get answers and fails. Laura, however, tells us something that indicates a bit more to us about James. She asks if he's going to yell at her if she doesn't tell him what her connection to Mary is. Perhaps James was also verbally abusive to Mary in some way, or to other people, and Laura somehow ascertained this information through however she was connected to Mary. It's also likely that Laura was verbally abused by many adults in her life. Her strange and rude patterns of behavior probably stem from this in some way. Her relationship to Mary is then further expounded upon to us. We learn that they both stayed at the hospital together and that's where they met and became friends. It's easy to imagine that she and Mary talked about James a lot considering how much Mary loved him. Laura probably also took notice of how little James visited Mary and maybe even yelled at Mary when she was around. Or Mary told her that James could yell occasionally but would try to excuse it. Something else to note here is that she's carrying what appears to be a pill bottle. We can't really tell what the contents are, but perhaps they have something to do with why she was in the hospital with Mary in the first place. However, the most important thing to take away here is mentioned almost offhandedly. Mary didn't die 3 years ago. Laura claims to have met Mary 1 year ago in the hospital. We already know James is an extremely unreliable narrator, but this fact completely changes how much we trust his perception of things. Just how recently did Mary die? Did she really die of an illness? What does Laura know? It could just be Silent Hill's strange time dilation at work, but that often doesn't have such a drastic effect on the inhabitants. It's usually only a few hours. It's a very surreal twist and adds so much to the atmosphere. James yells at Laura, which confirms how prone to anger he can be before he calms himself down and apologizes. Despite everything, he shows some care for Laura, and the two of them leave the room together because he figures the hospital is no place for a child, citing the strange monsters, which Laura of course doesn't see. When we leave the room though, Laura claims she needs to grab something that she left, Mary's letter that she had on top of the brick wall. She tells James to go into another room to look for it, but then locks the door behind him. Whatever Mary told her about James probably inspired her to do this, as this is probably one of the most clear acts of hatred toward him that Laura performs. Laura can't see the monsters, so she doesn't think his life is in any real danger though. She just sees it as a slightly rude prank to pull on someone who just yelled at her and called her a liar. While many people find Laura completely unsympathetic and cruel, I can't. She's a scared child who lost a friend. The monster she shuts us in here with is simply known as the Flesh Lips, which are hospital bed-like creatures with mouths on the bottom of them. These creatures are pretty obviously vaginal in nature, another representation of how James merely saw Mary as a sex object even when she was bedridden in the hospital. After defeating the Flesh Lips in a rather unceremonious boss fight, Silent Hill boss fights are really just not noteworthy, James, perhaps reminded of his verbal abuse at Mary in some unpleasant ways, passes out, and the next shot we see of him is him being wheeled on a gurney as we look at stained orange grates overhead. These grates are an indicator of something that we came to know quite well in the first Silent Hill game. The other world is encroaching upon the normal world. While the town's supernatural influences have certainly shown throughout the game thus far, the other world finally appearing cements that it has James in its grip. It's also fitting that it appears first in a hospital, where Alessa, the source of a lot of this town's supernatural despair, was tormented for so long. This scene also mimics a scene from the movie Jacob's Ladder, which, as I previously mentioned, is a major inspiration for these games. In this scene, the protagonist Jacob is wheeled through a mental hospital on a gurney and sees a lot of horrifying imagery throughout. Though James doesn't see anything particularly horrifying on his similar journey, his transition from the real world to the other world mirrors Jacob's own transition from his world to the hallucination world. The hallucinations in Jacob's world and their industrial, rusty nature are extremely evocative of Silent Hill's otherworld. Silent Hill is pretty obviously shaped by Jacob's Ladder in many ways, and both are fascinating works. When we get off the gurney, James is outside in a small square of grass with solid stone walls surrounding it. Now that James is in the other world, he's in new surroundings, but he's still within the confines of the hospital. This must have been the prison yard for the inmates at this place, confined to a very small cube. The map says this is a garden, but there's nothing really growing here. Perhaps setting them out in the rain was a form of punishing them? Speaking of the rain, perhaps that's to help signify that we have entered the otherworld as well. Water is inherently otherworldly, as I've said a lot. We step back inside. There's a strange electric fan surrounded by flesh beyond a grate that we can see here that is turned off. Electric fans are imposing machines that feel like they could kill you if you came too close to them, so it's a pretty disturbing image. It's also an interesting image because fans control wind, and wind is freedom. The fan is restricted from turning on, though, so there's no way for it to be free here in this insane asylum. Despite being in the other world now, most of the hospital appears to be much the same, with the major difference of tarps covering a lot of the surfaces, giving it an even more condemned feeling than it had previously. There are still some interesting things to see. For instance, in one room behind the tarps we see a wallpaper of a bunch of hands reaching for something. These must be a representation of the suffering that this location represents, the souls of those who were tortured here. Another interesting thing about this interaction is that James speculates on the meaning of this wallpaper as well, not just us. He openly debates on what it means, which is not something he does that often. Perhaps he found the imagery confusing or particularly evocative enough to break him out of his consistent Mary-induced one-track mind, showing a rare artistic side and how even someone so twisted has some good qualities. In a hole above this drawing, we find a dry cell battery and the key to the basement storeroom. Maybe the reason the hands were reaching for the dry cell battery was because they desired death and aspired to be like it. Maybe James also aspires to die as well, but he continues onward to the path to the truth. Or maybe it was the opposite. Maybe they're reaching onto it for another chance at life, even though the battery itself was dead, because it appeared to be something that could energize them. One other thing we can find here is a memo written on one of the tarps. It tells us of a ring that was left in the basement's basement. This brings to mind how James lost his marriage in the darkest point of his life, the death of Mary, which could be seen as his basement's basement. Perhaps he even threw it away himself, considering how much he obviously resented her in her dying days. It's pretty clear that this note refers to the basement storeroom key that we just acquired, but we don't know what we need the ring for yet. In another room, there's a refrigerator lying on the ground that James can't open on his own. He notes that he might need another person to open it. James needs someone else in order to continue to progress. He just doesn't realize that yet, just like how he most likely didn't realize just how important Mary was to helping him get through his own life. In life, you can only really figure out yourself by yourself, but that doesn't mean you don't need help sometimes. Since we don't have another person around, though, James just has to keep exploring the building and looking for other leads. There's a scrap of paper in one of the near-identical hospital rooms that talks about something incredibly bizarre. It writes about a lady on a door, one that judges all those who pass and only lets those without sin through. The imagery of the lady seems to call back to the Virgin Mary once more. With a twinge of Buddha, considering the metaphor that the note uses of the bridge of thread collapsing under sin being incredibly similar to the story of the spider's thread. Of course, neither Buddha nor Mary devour sinners, but there's still punishment for sin doled out by Buddha in that tale. And though Mary is not often depicted as a punisher, she is a major signifier of a religion self-obsessed with judgment. This angelic lens also applies to James's Mary as well. It is yet another framing of her as a savior of James, one that he rejected in life. As for the fact that she is a lady of the door, perhaps that implies that James must be cleansed of some sin before he can come to the truth about himself. Without her approval, he cannot continue. Right outside this room, we can see the lady of the door, whose pensive glance is reminiscent of the Virgin Mary, but the door will not open for James. There's something that he must do first that we aren't yet aware of. If we return to the room Maria was staying in the hospital in the normal world, in the other world all we can find are empty medicine bottles on the nightstand next to the bed she was lying in. Maria has taken off somewhere, now James is in search of her instead of Mary or Laura. We just saw a door with a depiction of Mary herself on it, and James's immediate thoughts are about Maria. She is the ultimate distraction for him. Their proximity is both an indication of their closeness as ideas and also as a sign of James's wandering mind. Regardless, wherever Mary is, Maria is sure to follow. While descending to the basement's basement, we can find a strange room with an iron gate that only emits a squealing sound. The hospital is poorly maintained and falling apart, so it's natural that the building makes noises, but perhaps it's also a sign of some creature that lives here. Or maybe it's the squealing of an infant, one that was supposed to come from the marriage between James and Mary, but was never born. Whatever the case, we press on to the basement's basement, the storeroom. Within the storeroom, we can find it in complete disarray. Most importantly, there are bloody handprints on the side of a bookshelf here. Is this to represent how the quest for knowledge is frowned upon by society and leads to bloodied hands? Or maybe that the acquisition of knowledge itself is a form of violence? It's also to show that going forward to the truth will be painful, considering James needs to follow suit with the bloodied hands in order to descend further into finding out what's really happening, i.e. pushing the bookshelf. Maybe even also showing that in order to get through the town, he has to push aside some forms of rationalism and empiricism, since it simply doesn't abide by those things. Once the bookshelf is pushed aside, a deeper indentation is revealed in the storeroom from behind it. Before we can go down there, though, we are greeted by Maria once again. James immediately mistakes her for Mary, which makes Maria incredibly angry. It seems that she's not entirely idealized. She has some amount of interiority beyond what James wants at that moment. This is something that isn't explored a ton in base Silent Hill 2, but will be in a later revision that I might talk about in a separate video at some point down the line. Whatever the case, she joins up with you again, and even though the interaction is unpleasant, it's hard not to imagine that this is what James wants from Mary in some way. Maria is dependent on him, terrified that he would even think of leaving her alone in such a dangerous place. She needs him by her side. Mary, though she was terminally ill, didn't need James. She had other people to help take care of her, like Laura. Even in moments that are uncomfortable for James, Maria still serves to show us everything James wanted from Mary. And in this case, she enables him to play out a strange savior fantasy he never could with his wife. We also learn a bit more about Maria's care for Laura. It's almost maternal in nature. Seeing as how they knew each other in the hospital, it's incredibly likely that Mary was like a mother to Laura. This trait of hers rubbed off on Maria, even though it's not something James would have known about. Perhaps it's simply part of James's idealization of her that's unrelated to Laura's existence, but coincidentally fits with it. That of Mary as the biblical figure. It's in this basement's basement that we find the ring that was mentioned before. It's made of copper, which is a mineral that was associated with Venus, the Roman equivalent to the Greek goddess of beauty Aphrodite, due to its beauty. Venus is a symbol of femininity that's prominent throughout Western culture, so it's pretty easy to deduce that this ring is supposed to be Mary's, someone who James sees as quite beautiful. Something else of interest about this ring, though, is the engraving of a spider on the side of it. This obviously refers to the thread that we spoke of earlier regarding the woman on the door, but also spiders are often creatures associated with women. Within Japanese folklore in particular, there are the Jorogumo, which are spider yokai who transform into seductive women, not unlike Maria. Spiders are also just generally associated with death throughout several different cultures since they are, well, deadly creatures. We keep coming back to it, but the story of the spider's thread shows this. There's something otherworldly about them, something about them that indicates that they can travel between the afterlife and the material plane, just as there is something otherworldly about your wife allegedly coming back from the grave and beckoning you to a town. If we enter the elevator at this point with Maria in tow, we'll be treated to a strange game show where we have to answer questions about Silent Hill. It's an interesting way of reminding you that despite its strange and amorphous nature, Silent Hill is a consistent place that has congruency in some of its aspects. Walter Sullivan, the lakeside amusement park from Silent Hill 1, and even the street we came to the hospital from are all referenced here. We're rewarded with some basic items for succeeding, but it mainly serves as a way to get you to reflect on the journey thus far and to realize that this is still all tangible if you found yourself losing your footing. It's one of the few times the game throws you a bone. When we return to the refrigerator with Maria in tow, she and James are able to open it, though not without Maria continuing to act as if she's helpless without James. Only through the teamwork of husband and wife were they able to move forward. Well, not his wife, but someone who looks just like her, except her hair and her clothes, of course. The ring we find here is noted by Maria to not be very cute, further indicating that it's James's ring. And what an interesting ring it is. The ring is made out of lead, a metal known for being, well, extremely toxic to even touch, as we talked about earlier. This could be an indication how James himself is frankly pretty toxic to be around, to use a term that I think is kind of rote. He abused his wife, he's dismissive to Laura and Maria, and he kind of treats Eddie like an absolute joke. The only person he's consistently kind to is Angela, and she's going through some shit, so I think that's just being a decent human being at that point. Something I find more interesting about the ring, though, is the symbol on it. The symbol on James's ring is a man's bloated, dead face. Is this to imply that James is dead, much like Mary? Not in a literal sense, mind you. If James were literally dead, then this game would get a whole lot stupider. But metaphorically. Maybe he feels as if the day he got married was the day he died, like some kind of boomer, chauvinistic loss of freedom to wife type thing. And that's why a corpse is associated with his wedding ring. Whatever the case, we pocket the ring and we go back to the lady of the door. Sure enough, these symbols of matrimony are what the lady approves of. Does Silent Hill see marriage as sanctimonious? Or more likely, does James himself see it as sanctimonious bond that he failed to uphold? Whatever the case, it is only through the help of others that James is able to get closer to the truth. And so he does. As we descend further into the depths of the hospital, we find another note from our friend Joseph Barkin. It's here we learn that he stole the key to the Silent Hill Historical Society Museum, something you may have seen on the map from glancing at it occasionally while outside, and placed in the park behind the statue of Jennifer Carroll, that holy woman of the Order we talked about earlier. Of course, the museum is inextricably tied to the Order in all its forms. The cult is what made the town what it is in the first place. No wonder it's the only way to learn its history, which is also simply a brutal commentary on how organized religion and history themselves have been so heavily intertwined throughout our own existence as well. As a side note, I find his misspelling of praying here interesting. Instead of spelling it with an A, it's an E. While Barkin is prone to misspellings, this one is pretty fitting. Jennifer Carroll isn't praying. She isn't a holy figure. She was a predator of the cult. At the bottom of the seemingly endless and suspenseful stairs, we enter a seemingly endless and suspenseful hallway. Nothing is in there, until Pyramid Head suddenly appears and starts attacking both James and Maria. What ensues is a classic hallway chase sequence, one where James's obsession with self-harm is trying to destroy one of the few lights of joy that he had in Silent Hill. Pyramid Head, notably, is also wielding a different weapon this time around, the spear. This is pretty directly phallic, but also it brings to mind the spear of Longinus, the spear that pierced Jesus while he was being crucified by the Romans. The reason behind this connection is apparent as soon as Pyramid Head runs Maria through with the spear, our Jesus figure murdered for the sake of James's sins. Perhaps James, much like Longinus himself, will end up converting to some kind of holy good, or perhaps he will fail. The song that plays during this section is known as Block Mind, and while the obvious parallel is that Pyramid Head has a very blocky looking, head. The other is that James is extremely stubborn in his inability to see the truth, whatever that truth may be. He has a block mind, one that doesn't seem to let him go through the literal twisting mental passageways he needs to in order to understand what's fully going on. After Maria's death, when James is alone in the elevator, the song Magdalene starts to play. This is an interesting title for the song to have. Magdalene is a major biblical character who traveled with Jesus on his journey and was one of the witnesses to his crucifixion. James, in this case, is Magdalene, though unlike her, he is not a holy figure. As James laments the loss of Maria, it is not because she died just for him and that she didn't deserve such a fate. It's that he lost a tool he used to make himself feel better about himself. On our way out of the hospital, we find a note from the director along with a key to the hospital lobby that will allow us to get out of here. It simply reads,
"He who is not bold enough to be stared at from across the abyss is not bold enough to stare into it himself."
It's here in the Silent Hill Historical Society where James will face the abyss and embrace it. But first, we need the key from Jennifer Carroll's statue, which we can only acquire with a letter and a wrench. The former of which has obvious symbolic value to James, and the latter of which most likely refers to a toxically patriarchal idea he, like so many young men, has pigeonholed himself into, that he needs to be able to fix anything, even a divine illness beyond his control. After we gather this information, we see Laura walking outside the window. Yet another instance of her ethereally beyond our grasp, but at this point, without Maria's motherly intervention, James simply doesn't care that much. He's back to being completely fixated on his one goal, to find a wife that most likely isn't waiting for him anywhere. Let's get out of this hospital.
I'm not your Mary.
When we leave the hospital, we get a monologue from James about the current situation, the first time he truly seems to question whether or not Mary is actually in the town of Silent Hill. He asks if she could really still be there, and begins to think Mary is taking revenge on him. For what, James? The years of abuse? Or perhaps there's another thing that she could have been taking revenge for. Whatever the case, we continue along the path we've been given to find the things listed in the director's office. Something to note about the town at this point is that it's now nighttime, as we saw on the rooftop earlier. It's just a lot more eerie now, reflecting James's own mental state. He feels truly cold and alone, with a lost sense of faith in this holy figure, that being Mary, and having lost Maria, the only person who truly seemed to care about him in the first place. Now the streets just feel empty and dark. Not even more dangerous, just more silent and dreadful. Along the way, we travel through a new alleyway shortcut where the floor is covered in grates above a dark abyss with no visible bottom. While this is just a consistent staple of the Otherworld in the Silent Hill saga, appearing both in the first and third games as well, I also feel as if it's an indicator of James's headspace right now. He's extremely close to just killing himself. The abyss is closer than it has been at any point in this adventure so far, and he is at his lowest point yet. This is further indicated by the enemies that travel beneath the grates. These creatures are feminine, contorted figures that are trapped beneath some of the grates in Silent Hill, only able to hang on to them. They have no recourse for this pain, and one small slip would lead them to fall into the abyss. Just like the mindset James himself is in. They can never bring themselves out of their suffering, never be free from the hell that is life hanging from the grates. As for the reason why they are feminine in nature, perhaps it's because of the mental duress James put Mary through. Maybe he thinks that her mindset was like this as well. If we return to Neely's bar at this point, since the shortcut drops us off near there, we can find a message written in blood on the wall that wasn't there before, near the one about the hole from way earlier in the game. It simply states that in order for James to see Mary, he should simply die, though he might not be going to the same place as her. It's a pretty ominous sentiment and obviously ties into James' own self-loathing. Of course he thinks she should die and go to hell. He was a pretty bad husband and he blames himself for Mary's death often. This message appears in the bar because they're probably thoughts he had while he would drink to cope with Mary's sickness. Maybe he would even vocalize them. When we finally find the letter in the wrench, we can read the letter, which informs us that the director knew that the key to the museum had been stolen from him. The fact that the letter starts in the middle of a thought is an impactful choice. Silent Hill is a way of catching people in the middle of things. We didn't know anything about who James was before he started his journey to find his dead wife. We also started in the middle of a thought. Context in Silent Hill is a privilege, not a standard. The letter then alludes to an idea that has been continually repeated throughout the game, that truth is painful and often in opposition to tranquility. Something incredibly interesting occurs at the end of this letter too. It mentions James directly. This incredibly blunt shove at James towards the truth is an indication of how he can no longer distract himself as he did with the apartments in the hospital. He must actually face his issues head on now. We only find the key directly behind the statue of Jennifer Carroll through digging deep into the darkness. By digging deep, I mean in a literal sense. James literally digs into a mound in the ground, yet another easy metaphor for descending. Anyway, notice how the key to the historical society is behind Carroll's statue. The Order and the town's history are inextricably tied, to be sure, but what we're going to see is something the Order would never want us to learn. One of their symbols has her back turned to it. Through learning the dark truth of the town, perhaps we will learn more about the dark truth of James. The key being bronze is simply a connection to the religiosity of the whole thing. Bronze is a metal often used to make religious artifacts according to the King James Bible. Even if it was more likely brass that was being referred to in the Old Testament, the King James Bible is probably the most well-known translation of the text. Along the way to the Silent Hill Historical Society, we can find a sign outside stating that the building has a boat attraction that brings people to Lakeview Hotel and Lakeside Amusement Park. While we won't be going to Lakeside anytime soon, there's something extremely mystical about the implication here. The journey through the tattered history of the town giving way to a reflective voyage across the water. We'll return to this later because the bridge to the hotel is out and James now must go through this way. He must confront himself to find Mary. Another interesting sight is the Lakeview Hotel sign on the side of the road we encounter on the way here. It's old and decrepit. We know their little soiree in Silent Hill was only a few years ago, but it seems the hotel, much like their relationship, has seen much better days. It died with Mary. There's one other billboard outside here. It displays a stork and talks about some kind of baby and kid store. We know that Mary probably wanted children, seeing as she is quite the matronly figure and also her connection to Laura, so it's no surprise here that children are represented here in some way. Its proximity to the Silent Hill Historical Society could indicate something to us. Maybe James was afraid of having children, afraid of committing to something so much larger than him. And honestly, I wouldn't really blame him for that. Yeah, for the first time I'm not being angry at James. He's only 29, and Mary was only 25 when she died. I would be scared to have children that young as well, and I wouldn't recommend it. This fear manifests in the darkest recesses of his subconscious, the place where all his bad memories go. Let's talk about the Silent Hill Historical Society proper now. In the first room, the only image of note is one of the interior of a church, presumably one of the orders, but in the second room there is a lot more to discuss. A strange photo of a bunch of people sitting together, presumably the founders of the museum? To whom do we give the right of maintaining history? As is so often in real life, apparently uniform rows of white people with lots of money who want it portrayed a certain way. Possibly at the behest of outside forces, in this case a religious cult. An interesting painting that we can read the description for in this room is the waterfront landscape. The description itself isn't that interesting, it merely states what's in the artistic pieces without actually giving us any other critique or analysis. Although it does tell us that the lake has always been a special place for the people of the town, it's the fact that it's missing that grabs my attention. Silent Hill's pre-colonial native history has been completely wiped from the board, and even this 1820 painting has been erased. just showing how anything pre-colonial in this world is continually destroyed. The big painting that I'm sure most people are waiting for me to talk about here, though, is the one at the back of the room. It's the most defined and it's the one we get the closest look at. It's Pyramid Head standing in the rain. Simply titled Misty Day Remains of the Judgment, it turns out that Pyramid Head is such a fitting symbol of judgment both for the town and for James in particular because he is made of the same symbols of the cult's executioners. This painting is not a depiction of our Pyramid Head specifically, just an executioner of Silent Hill. James saw this when he visited the town with Mary and the image stuck with him, which is what tied the figure to his own feelings of self-hatred and judgment. And I assume it'll stick with us too. It gives Pyramid Head an even more divine role than before, considering he's directly based on James's experiences with a religion, that being the Order. One final thing of note in this particular room is a photo of a local coal mine called, well, the Wilts Coal Mine. Wilts refers back to the street in the town that was assumedly named after this coal mine. Perhaps its closeness to the lake gave it some spiritual power. Maybe coal mining was why settlers even decided to stay here in the first place? We will learn more about this coal mine in a bit, but for now, let's continue. In our next room, there are several things on display that James shows little interest in, like a manuscript or a photo of a family. Wow, James, rude. There are a few things he does take an interest in, though. For example, there's a photo of Brookhaven Hospital, where we just were, that describes its history. Apparently it wasn't always a mental hospital and was first constructed in order to treat a plague that had come down on the town. Plagues have some pretty obvious religious ideas attached to them, like the plagues God set out on the Egyptians for persecuting the Jews in the Bible. I do believe that the town of Silent Hill was due for some persecution from whatever supernatural force was governing it at the time. After all, colonists had just seized the town, so it may be a similar plague of protection here. It also could very well be the same plague that affected Mary before she died. A holy disease killing a holy figure? That might be strange, but perhaps in life she was just Mary. And she was only sanctified by the town after her passing due to James' own reverence of her post-mortem. Another photo we can find here is of a deep, dark hole in an abstracted building. It's one of the first truly surreal visions we see in Silent Hill 2, and it's another allusion to the holes James needs to face, the way he needs to go to find his way further to the truth. And then we descend into one of those said holes. A burnt part of the wall gives way to a long, descending staircase. It is another moment of silence, one where James and the player both are pensive and reflective on a never-ending stairwell. Except it's not endless. Just when you think about turning back, you see the end. While we descend the staircase, a long, droning foghorn plays. This is another signal of the otherworldliness of our voyage. We're heading into the water now, entering some secrets underneath the surface. We step into another reality. Our descent leads us into Toluca Prison, the secret place beneath the lake and beneath the historical society. This is where the true history of Silent Hill, and our cast of characters, is without obfuscation. The sinister truth below the Order's lies. The fact that James associates his own darkness with prison is telling about what his truth is. Maybe he feels like he should have been arrested for whatever he's done. We are first greeted with a prison book that James can barely read. The horrors of being an inmate are inconceivable to most people, especially likely reactionary James Sunderland. We continue on and find a jail cell. It's important to note that the appearance of the cell is quite similar to the patient's rooms in the mental hospital, a comparison that feels extremely fitting, but that's not the most interesting thing in this cell. Here we find 3 more exhibits on the wall, each showing a darker side to the town's history. First, we learn of Toluca Prison's construction during the Civil War and its usage as an internment camp for POWs. We even learn that they got to choose between being skewered to death or strangled to death, a false agency made only to mock those in captivity, which may be how James feels about his own life right now with no choice but to follow Mary's words. The final images of the executioners of the town pouring blood out, and it's clear as day that they were tied to Pyramid Head. Unlike Pyramid Head's judgment, which is self-inflicted for James, these executioners murdered prisoners for disobeying. The fact that they were involved with the prisons at all indicates another layer of control that the Order had over Silent Hill, and also shows the Christian roots of judgment and brimstone that still line the religion in spite of how much they despise Christianity. A classic portrayal of the hypocrisy of organized religious hierarchy. Eventually, we come across a sight similar to the one displayed in one of the paintings we just saw. A hole in the prison surrounded by abstraction. James jumps down the hole, but not without a long period of hesitation. This is his final act against the current of finding the truth. The first time he completely gives in to the journey. He's succumbed to the depths now. At the very bottom of the hole, we find that it's an empty, dried-up well of some kind. James is completely trapped here, though unharmed. He's afraid and alone in the dark, claustrophobic as the walls close in, though. It's only when he continues to desperately try that he tears down one of the walls himself using a melee weapon that the way out of the darkness is found, the only time in the game an object is directly destructible. Once again, though the help of others is important and often necessary, only he can take this journey and get himself further. Only he can tear down the literal walls he's built for himself around his truth. This section of the prison is slightly flooded, the ethereal nature of the lake seeping into its halls. As we trudge through the waters, we find a lying figure down here. Prisons are places that persecute the mentally ill. The only difference between an institution and a jail is how they're portrayed, really. Prisoners are treated like monsters and slaves, and people with mental illnesses make up a lot of prison demographics. In this first room we enter in this new layer, which is completely bare, we find a key with spiral writing all over it. The spiraling sensation of going down further and further into James's mind is palpable. The key reads,
"'Tis doubt which leadeth thee to purgatory."
Which is simply a true statement, metaphorically speaking. Purgatory is the place of fence-sitters, where those who weren't particularly bad people but also not particularly good go for eternity, with potential to move onward if they put in the effort. James is stuck in his own purgatory right now, Silent Hill. Though he has certainly done wrong, he hasn't been able to move on from this limbo state of both knowing the truth and acknowledging what's wrong and deluding himself into not believing it, so for now he is in perpetual limbo. More pressing, however, is the fact that James's flashlight goes out. He once again has to find the way out of the darkness by himself, taking himself from the brink of death by using the battery that we found in the hospital. Another connection between the two locations, and perhaps another cry for suicidality from James, the final death of the battery that so many coveted because it too was dead like them. Suddenly, the room becomes covered in roaches. We know that this enemy is just one way James thought of Mary, so perhaps he sees this renewal of life, his light in the darkness, as something that Mary wants to take from him. He absolutely blamed Mary for her disease, and so he probably saw her as someone who ruined his life. Trying to exit the room reveals that it's locked behind us with only a random number keypad to be able to get out of it. There's no way of knowing, you just have to guess. Sometimes the only way away from the creeping thoughts is to dive into the unknown. Although, to go on a bit of side tangent here, I have avoided making a lot of value statements about the contents of the game thus far because I don't find those kinds of statements that interesting, but man, this room is kind of just annoying. That's all. Maybe it's supposed to mean that James saw Mary getting ill as annoying? Fuck if I know, I just hate this room. At the end of the next hallway is another hole with only a grate preventing us from falling. James uses the spiral writing key that he just acquired and without a doubt jumps into another hole, moving further from the limbo that key described, this time without hesitation. We land in what appears to be a prison cafeteria, though extremely dirty from misuse. The only light comes from James's newly renewed flashlight, which we use to see Eddie gun in hand. I take some umbrage with how Eddie is associated with the gun throughout the game that I would like to talk about now. It's implied that Eddie turned to gun violence because he was bullied through school. It's not only statistically unlikely for this to be the case in real life, but also just a gross piece of misinformation to be spreading, especially at the time right after the Columbine massacre. The propagation of gun violence isn't solely an effect of bullying. It's a whole myriad of systemic issues, ranging from a lack of mental health support for people and the misogynistic radicalization that is done through the internet so effortlessly. While I appreciate Team Silent's attempt at covering this issue and their genuine empathy for the subject, I think that they missed the mark a bit here. Eddie tells us that killing someone isn't really a big deal, which, okay, and motions putting a gun to someone's head and shooting them. It's interesting then that he both denies having killed people so vehemently and also hasn't actually killed anyone. He certainly seems to believe he has killed someone. Perhaps he's afraid of what we'll think of him? The camera pans over to a corpse in the cafeteria, maybe someone who made fun of his weight combined with him being in a place full of food. At first, he doesn't dodge the accusation that he killed someone. Instead, he prattles on about how it was deserved because of how he was made fun of. It's only after James reacts poorly that Eddie decides to back down. He takes pride in taking power from those who make fun of him, almost seeing himself as entitled to it. Again, it's interesting commentary, and this aspect of it rings true in some senses. These kinds of men are often fixated on being entitled to social capital, though it's more often targeted at women who reject them due to how society treats women like objects. Eddie decides to leave on his own, empowered by the idea that he could take a life, assumedly. James questions this, but just lets him leave without much further discussion. Also in this room, next to a framed, recursive, and mind-bending photo of the room itself, we can find a tablet titled The Gluttonous Pig. This is obviously a derisive way to refer to Eddie, perhaps how James sees him. Or, more likely, it's both James and how the prison would view him. This is the cafeteria after all, and people being fed isn't exactly the best thing in the world for prison profits. It's also interesting to note that the design on the plate is similar to a lot of Mesoamerican carvings, perhaps referring back to how Toluca Lake itself refers to Aztec spirituality in its name. Buried beneath the historical society is the true history of the native people that the colonizers tried to remove permanently. Even though Silent Hill is in the US, so there probably wouldn't be Aztec people living here. In the hallway just outside this room, we can find some handgun bullets on a warden's desk next to a ledger. There have been bullets sprinkled throughout the game in spots, of course, as a formality of gameplay, but I didn't think most were notable. Here, however, I think it tells us something about the way prisons are run. Violence is committed by the wardens in order to keep the inmates in line. They keep their ammunition extremely close. And really, with the twisting hallways and corridors that all look the same, implications that it was run entirely by the Order, what else could Silent Hill 2 be saying other than prison is an occult torture maze? The nature of punitive justice is simply a religious moral play, punishment for the damned. Like so much of capitalist culture, it is built upon the unjust violence of organized religion that was fostered in feudalism. It's what I think is the most politically provocative area in Silent Hill 2, and if it weren't for the ideas presented in the next two areas, it would easily be my favorite. In what we can assume to be a prison shower area, we find a tablet called the Seductress, which most likely represents Angela. While it could represent Maria due to her being a literal seductress, Angela's more likely considering that these puzzles tend to refer to the three people who entered the town. I kind of wish it didn't represent Angela though, because it just makes me feel gross to say. It's probably just based on how others judge her and the way she judges herself, and it just feels nauseating to think about, which is probably intentional. It's how the prison would see her. You can probably put it all together now what happened to Angela considering you find this tablet in a prison shower, which are commonly associated with sexual abuse. Her reservations and her demeanor are all indicative of someone suffering intense sexual trauma, and I think Silent Hill 2 excels at portraying this in a nuanced way. It's a topic that I feel really strongly about, and I think that Angela is incredibly well written, which I will discuss further as we get more into the game. This is assumedly also why she wishes her father and her brother were dead. They were the ones who did this to her. In one hall of jail cells full of locked up lying figures, we find a cell with occult writing all over it. More confirmation that the prison was in fact run by the Order, and that perhaps their experiments were conducted on prisoners, a historical practice dating back eons. Again, the church and prison as construct are inextricably tied, so this comes as no surprise. Scattered all over the floor are books with a bunch of interesting names. Black Magic from the Abyss is a title that piques my curiosity, as the idea of the Abyss is often associated with the idea of truth throughout the text of Silent Hill 2. Perhaps it's yet another way to say that the truth is hell, that the process of finding truth is a painful experience. The book on resurrection is a pretty simple idea referring back to Mary's own resurrection through the town. Another book touts to be the Chronicle of Agrippa. While there are many Agrippas this could refer to, and on first glance it would most likely be the biblical Agrippa, better known as Herod, I like to think this is mainly in reference to the first century philosopher Agrippa. Agrippa's philosophy is mainly centered around the creation of 5 tropes of suspension of judgment or skepticism, which would fit into the Order's general skepticism of the world around them. A philosophical viewpoint such as this, where there is no clear basis for truth, as he found all the senses to be fallible, is a framework that lends itself easily to a divine truth. The book on iron rings is most likely both a reference to the recurring rings we see throughout Silent Hill 2's narrative, the one that bind Mary and James together, and also the fact that iron was one of the most important elements in alchemy and one of the foundations for modern chemistry. In Silent Hill 1, you find that the Order is extremely concerned with alchemy. It's only fitting that this interest would be considered in Silent Hill 2, especially since the story itself is inherently alchemical. It's about the process of changing a man through exposing him to deliberate events in the town. Much like any story that is about intentional change, alchemy applies here, whereas the first Silent Hill doesn't involve the protagonist changing much at all. The rest of the books here refer back to the traditionally demonic practices that don't much interest me, though there is one final book that I find worth discussing. It's titled The Angels of Mercy and Favor. Perhaps the Order was not only experimenting on prisoners, but also pretending to show some sort of forgiveness in their own twisted way to them through conversion to the church. We see this a lot in modern prisons. Prisoners are often exploited into becoming members of the faith in order to redeem themselves. Considering the Order's ties to Christianity, whether they like it or not, it would also make sense that they too act as if they are all forgiving. James's dismissive attitude towards these books is kind of amusing. Despite everything he has seen in Silent Hill, he is still secular, which I suppose makes some amount of sense. There is no reason for him to abandon the logic systems he's had that kept him safe. even when they're being torn apart in front of his eyes. He doesn't even adhere to those same Enlightenment-era frameworks when they don't serve him, hiding within his own delusions about the truth of whatever he did to Mary, so it's clear to me that they're only a safety net to him. On the desk here, in the center of all the ritualistic drawings, we find a wax doll. Another piece of childish innocence, though this time instead of being juxtaposed against James, it's juxtaposed against the surroundings. One can only really wonder what the Order would have used a wax doll like this for. Wax is often associated with eternity, perhaps it was some experiment to make prisoners immortal that the Order wanted to use for themselves. Whatever the case, it leaves a foul impression. Yet another indication of the experiments at play here and the tortures that the prisoners had to go through, just like how much real-life human testing is done on prisoners as they are seen as subhuman. In another line of prison cells, there is total emptiness except for what can only be described as the growlings of some primordial and demonic beast. This is Silent Hill's demonstration of the feelings a panopticon would instill. The constant observation is terrifying. Even when there are no enemies in the surrounding area, you're still being monitored by something lurking in the dark. Something murmuring something foul behind your back. It's also just the scariest room in the game by far to me. It makes me uncomfortable. While we're in here, we can find one of the cells has 3 strange crayon drawings that are worth discussing. The first is on the ground to show whoever this represents feels downtrodden. Titled 436 People at a Recital, it depicts a performance where 436 people are in attendance, leading to the figures on stage to panic. While this most likely doesn't refer to any one specific event in Eddie's life, it's absolutely about him. Eddie is constantly thinking about what others think of him, and even justifies murdering people with his social ostracization. He is very concerned with his body image and who he is because he has been bullied his whole life. It's really sad. The other drawing, however, is on the bed. It's a drawing titled Burning Man, referring back to the destruction of memories and humanity, but it's not a depiction of a person. It appears to be a depiction of a building, and this drawing is the one belonging to James. We don't know what building is being immolated yet in this image, but James does like to burn his own past down and bury it under performance and obfuscation. Maybe it's the Lakeview Hotel we're looking at. We'll just have to wait and see. The final drawing is lifted higher than the one of James and the one of Eddie. It's titled Woman in Flight. This is the drawing associated with Angela, and it's her flying through the sky. This is probably however she felt when she escaped her abusers, even if it was just to run away into Silent Hill. The high of getting away from them, it felt like she was flying. She was on top of the world, having finally escaped those who hurt her. Have I mentioned just how much I love Angela's story? In another cell here, we find the final tablet, the oppressor belonging to James. This obviously references James' abuse of Mary, although their illustration on the tablet implies some sort of physical altercation between the two, making their already negative relationship even more disturbing. What did James exactly do to Mary? He certainly doesn't want us to know, and I'm not even sure if he knows himself at the moment, but the town is bringing him closer to knowing. Of course, the tablet is surrounded by magazines, knowing James probably porn. On the wall, though, is something more interesting. Above the tablet are images of the crucifixion. Maybe James sees himself as bearing Mary's burden, as some kind of Jesus figure, even though he isn't one. Like some kind of weird form of self-righteous pity for having a wife who got really sick. Upon trying to leave this cell, the doors are shut. It is only by turning the flashlight off that we are able to leave, James needing to embrace the darkness once more. While the flashlight is semiotically a beacon toward the truth, being in the dark is also a way of finding your way through things. Sometimes the only way to find the truth is to discard your own preconceptions. Resetting your context can bring you new clues. In the far eastern room of the prison, we can find a gallows surrounded by an almost completely empty space. It's pretty eerie imagery, the naturally isolating feeling of being on death row, of tons of people being in attendance for your execution but having nobody there for you. Depicted on the side of it is another Aztec hieroglyph of 2 pyramid heads flanking a single stick figure. Judgment at the hands of the executioners. There are 3 nooses hanging from the scaffold, one for each of our protagonists, of course. Above the small hieroglyphic it simply reads,
I give you blood to atone for the 3 sins.
Blood and sin are intrinsically connected ideas. Religiously, it was through Jesus giving his own blood that sin was absolved from humans. Perhaps Silent Hill is referring to it giving these 3 people a chance to better themselves through its tribulations. By damaging them, it is giving them the path to salvation. James, Angela, and Eddie are not inherently broken. They have things they need to work on, but they can all come out of this better people. Though in Angela's case, it's not about her personal morality and more about getting out of her damaging mindset. They can grow or they can be executed by their own flaws, the nooses both representing judgment and suicide. After we place the 3 tablets we found here, nothing seems to really happen. It's only on our way out of this room that we find an upside-down horseshoe where there wasn't one before. This is an obvious bad omen. An upside-down horseshoe means that all of your luck is falling out of it. I think it's a little late for a warning like that, Silent Hill, but thanks. I suppose it's to show that the road to change will be full of misfortunes, despite the fact that all 3 are trying their best. There are a few other rooms that are worth discussing in the prison that are necessary for James's continuing spiral into his own subconscious. There's a visitor's room that many prisons might have, one where there's glass between the prisoner and whoever they're visiting, where the 2 can talk to each other. Notably, James is framed by the camera as the prisoner in this room, continuing his view of self-judgment. Maybe he's even deserving of this role. In another room, there's a hallway where there would normally be a desk obstructing your way through it, but it's been broken in 2 by something. It's a harrowing visual. Just what happened here, anyway? Another sign of violence in the prison. If we re-enter the visiting room from the other side, we can find a lighter on the other side of the glass. Did Mary smoke? Is that why she got sick? Probably not. Her sickness seems to be thematically tied to ideas of divine cruelty. The lighter, then, may just refer to her bringing support to James in his life, being a literal light in his life. Though he was never actually in prison, James seemed to often feel estranged from his wife after her illness, but we know she still loved him and tried to support him through that, even if her light had just become a flicker in a lighter. In the warden's office, which is much nicer than anything else in the prison, yet again illustrating the power dynamics that those who are seen as broken by society are subjected to, we can find a local Silent Hill magazine on top of the desk. It talks about a supernatural incident at the lake in the early 1900s where a steamboat called the Little Baroness sank in the lake. The ethereal foghorn we heard while descending the staircase into the prison was actually a spectral recreation of this event. James himself might sink as well if he's not careful in how he continues. The name The Little Baroness indicates that it's probably a high-end pleasure cruise boat of some kind, full of richer folks, seeing as a baroness is obviously the nobility. Considering the fact that it sank, Silent Hill probably has no love for rich people. Who can blame it? It was colonialist expansion that caused so much of the town's historical suffering. The reason I think the town claimed them specifically is because, much like many of these classic supernatural stories, the boat and the passengers were never found. There's a further incident extrapolated on that we can't read about since most of the pages were torn out. It's assumedly too terrifying for us to know. It then goes on to discuss again that there are many corpses at the bottom of Lake Toluca, and that maybe they're reaching up at the boats on the surface and beckoning them to come down. Silent Hill yet again toys with the idea of the mystical and otherworldly properties of lakes and how the underworld crosses over through them. On the shelf next to this, we can find a diary that was presumably written by the warden, yet another instance of how much those in the prison system hate their prisoners. It describes prisoners like base animals, ones that only seek to justify and cause pain. Perhaps this is one way that James sees himself, and it's absolutely how James sees prisoners. It's much easier for him to justify prisons and their abuse if prisoners are irredeemable creatures. It muses on human nature even existing in the cruel conditions of a prison. James's own tenacity in spite of his self-hatred is fascinating. There's just such a strong sense of self-preservation here. In the warden's closet nearby, we find a hunting rifle and some broken glass. This one weapon being in this one spot reinforces everything we gathered from how the warden saw the people in the prison. They were animals to him. Animals that he saw fit to hunt down and slaughter. It's a striking visual and one of the most haunting ideas present in Silent Hill 2. All of these dehumanizing and horrible worldviews could simply be waved away as disciplining the prisoners. It's truly terrifying how little anyone cares. To progress further, we have to combine the lighter, the wax doll, and the horseshoe to create a faux handle for a trapdoor in the prison's hallways. This is an interesting connection. In order to continue on the path of misfortune, James needs to melt his innocence down. Once again, he needs to cast aside his safety net, though also he is using Mary's light to cut through his own haze. The symbol of the cult, even if it is also one of innocence, is burned through using the light of the biblical version, the eternal struggle between the order and Christianity represented through signifier. It's a pretty simple way to show the continued idea of James needing to go down the path of truth, and this time when he jumps down the trapdoor, he doesn't hesitate at all. A trapdoor being the way to the truth is also an interesting choice. It shows that truth isn't always in places you might expect, and that the way forward might be hidden in plain sight. When we land on this next floor, our only option is to enter a morgue. This morgue in particular is full of bodies, both an indication of the lack of care given to the prisoners in the facility, and also an indication of how being imprisoned metaphorically ends your life completely. It's hard to bounce back from that. If you inspect a corpse lying on the table, James will say he didn't see it moving, which means he most likely did see it move and is just lying to us like the dirty guy he is. corpses. There'd be no reason for him to note it otherwise. If you look into the holes that contain corpses, James will see something indescribable. Morgues have some amount of spiritual power, culturally, because they're where the dead go. It's only natural that this would be a place that seems a little haunted. And even James's rationalism can't really blanket him from what's going on in front of his eyes here. In the room immediately after, we find a corpse sitting next to yet another hole for James to dive into. James muses on the idea that the corpse was supposed to go into this hole, which is another indication of how the prison system treats its dead. It's also an interesting indication of what James is supposed to do. He's supposed to jump in a hole that corpses get dumped in. The way forward once again asks him to confront his own death. He does not hesitate once more as he jumps. We land in a mine shaft, which is assumedly one of the many tunnels constructed for the Wilts coal mine. The fact that it's connected to the prison tells us something incredibly bleak that is a sad reality for prisoners in the United States. Prisoners are treated as slave labor by these institutions. In the amendment to abolish slavery, it is stated that prisoners are still allowed to be treated as slaves. It's absolutely foul. Once we're done contemplating this, James once again has to drop through a hole and barrel deeper into the abyss. Deeper still in the mine shaft, we find an old mining elevator. James descends once again, but instead of a jump, he rides this elevator down further. It's yet another brief moment of calm in Silent Hill 2, one where you simply stand there and think about everything you've been presented with so far. It doesn't last too long before James is booed out of the elevator and into a strange room reminiscent of the walls of an apartment building. At the bottom of everything James has encountered in his path to the truth, he finds a place that looks similar to where he once lived. It's interesting that this place is known as a labyrinth, despite it resembling James's home. It's full of strange obstacles. There is one door James can't cross because of the wires strung across it, which he has no means of cutting through. Another simple barrier his mind has erected to finding what he needs to find. Though like so many things in the labyrinth, strangely abstracted yet familiar. It's a haunting sense of lost nostalgia that the entire place gives off. There is one room that is just a circle with great servings of the floor with those clinging enemies staring up at James. It's a cyclical hellish nightmare of an abstraction, accentuated by Pyramid Head wandering it at random, ready to attack at any moment. In the center of the circle is another room. Upon entering, we are given a bird's eye view of the room from behind the ceiling fan, a strange angle that positions James as stuck between its blades. Though I wouldn't exactly say Silent Hill has been hurting James physically much at all. In fact, his own nightmares shower him in healing items, as you may have noticed. This imagery of him being caught in the fan is pretty obviously showing where his emotional state is at. The room itself, once we can get a better look at it, is an operating room of some kind, with corpses in metal cages hanging from the ceiling. Due to the fact we can find the great knife on the table as a weapon for James to use, it's safe to assume that this must be Pyramid Head's room, if he can even have such a thing. It's where he performs his executions and surgical procedures with the shears on the desk. The medical imagery is obviously traumatic for James, considering what he went through with his wife, but also comes back to the rat-skull relationship between him and Pyramid Head as well. What does it say about James that he can use the great knife? Is he trying to take on a role as an arbiter of justice? Maybe before the events of the story, he doled out mortal judgment to someone he thought deserved it. Is it part of his desire for Pyramid Head to judge him? The acquisition of the Great Knife also doesn't bode well for James's suicidality. With this weapon in hand, we leave this room. As we go further into the labyrinthine yet mundane halls, we find a brief period where we traverse a flooded set of mine shafts, yet again twisting the real history of the town with James's fractured psyche. The small amount of flooding in the mines must be from the lake in some way, and perhaps it was from a real event that ended up happening here. Of course, it's also just James wading through his own regrets. I find the grimy quality of the water in this game to be really interesting. It truly reflects the game's entire feel. Water in games has a way of doing that. On the other side, we find a strange cube with many faces on it, all of them appearing with different colored eyes. They're all reminiscent of old bronze reliefs of philosophers, with each of their eyes being a different basic color. Red, blue, green. It all gives this strange mechanism very odd feeling. Aesthetically similar to something you might find while excavating Athens. This is the depths of the historical society. Perhaps James is now bringing in history not even related to Silent Hill. Or maybe the Athenian connection has to do with the puzzle it's directly associated with, a giant box that you rotate using the strange faces in order to gain access to more rooms. It's absolutely reminiscent of the cave from Platonic teachings, a room that changes reality based on minor perceptive details surrounding the viewer. In that case, it's based around shadows and flame, while here it's more spatial. It most likely refers back to James's own cave, how his perspective is limiting him from seeing the truth, and how all humans do this to some extent. It also calls back to his reactionary tendencies, in this case his fetishization of Greek philosophy. Though most reactionaries don't really understand it regardless, and I doubt James is uniquely learned. Once we solve that puzzle and come out on the other side, we find Maria in a jail cell. It's an interesting and striking image. For starters, how is Maria alive again? She is heavily associated with ideas of rebirth, being both Mary and Christ. Of course, the town also seems to still have use for her. More interestingly, though, is the fact that she's in a jail cell. Is the town doling out judgment on her? Is this her punishment for being seductress? Or is it James is doing, that he sees her as some kind of object that tricked him and now must be punished for her wicked sexuality like so many men have seen women over the ages? Maybe it's simply to communicate her position as a prisoner of the town. And what about the chair Maria is sitting in? It's reminiscent of Mary's flower motif, the ephemeral and delicate plant. Here Maria is also lounging in these symbols. She is delicate but perennial, much like a perennial. James is naturally very confused about Maria's return, which shows another aspect of the dichotomy between how much he does and doesn't care about Maria. He cares enough that this is one of the few things that pulls him out of his constant Mary-related trance, but he still doesn't see Maria as a person worthy of care, as a prisoner worthy of his judgment. Something more interesting here, though, is that Maria doesn't seem to remember what he's talking about at all. To her, she simply got lost in a hallway in the hospital. Her biblical death at the hands of Pyramid Head simply didn't occur. Is she lying to us, or is her existence inconsistent? Does she simply not remember? There's a dreamlike quality to Maria, like all of the town's creations, though it's even more jarring coming from her because unlike the rest of the town, she is an autonomous person. She's as much a victim as James or Angela or Eddie or Laura. Hell, probably even more so because she was born for the sole purpose of existing here. Maria then begins to talk about a videotape that James left at the Lakeview Hotel when he and Mary were on a vacation there. She speaks of James's memory as if it's poor, but obfuscates her role with Mary's. To James, they are becoming one and the same individual. The lines are being blurred for him. It's this next shot where the true purpose of the jail cells becomes clear. James is now framed as the one in prison, and Maria's chair makes it look like she's the one on the outside, considering her more comfortable sitting conditions. Yet another instance of James in the prison, his self-judgment made clear visually. The two of them are also positioned at an uncomfortable angle in this shot, one that makes you feel a little on edge, just like all the other aspects of the scene. If you couldn't tell, this is my favorite FMV in Silent Hill 2. James asks if she's Maria, and she responds with,
I'm not your Mary.
which is a strange and nuanced way to respond. Maria doesn't see herself as a defined entity yet. All she knows herself as is the person that James loves, that she's not. She's not Mary. She will never be the Mary that James looks for so desperately. She is so close to being everything that James wants, but she can never be Mary. That is her intrinsic lack. But she wishes she could be. She claims she can be anything James wants her to be. I know that desire well. The desire to be everything someone wants and not yourself. I really feel for Maria. I know a lot of people think she's just some evil demon, but I genuinely believe she's a person on some level. A person who's hurt and scared and alone and doesn't realize that her role is destined to end in tragedy for her. James promises to come to the other side of the bars to see Maria, claiming that he'll try to get to the other side of the bars to be by her side. It's clear that James has every intention of, well, sleeping with Maria, or at the very least being intimate with her. He has totally forgotten Mary in this moment. Now all he can think of is the idealized Mary right in front of him. He has finally been broken by the town. If you stay in the room for a bit, you can watch Maria pace around the room anxiously or sit on the bed and wait for James, assumably more comfortable than the chair. It's a nice visual to watch. It adds a bit of character to Maria and serves to humanize her even more than the game already has. I simply can't understand people who think of her solely as a monster. There's so much to indicate otherwise. On our way out of this room, we find a wire cutter sticking out of a bunch of sparking wires, a murder weapon stuck in its victim, a dying thing that James ends up taking the life out of. When the wire cutters are removed, the sparks stop. Maybe James feels as if he has the power to judge and put others down, that he is the one who can decide when a life ends, which is just a grotesque thing to think about other humans. He sees himself as some kind of mercy killer for this action. We use the wire cutters on the wires and descend further into the darkness. After another twisting labyrinth of samey hallways and submerged mineshafts, we emerge in a room with newspaper on the ground that we can read. It details the death of someone we can't quite make out the name of due to blood from the incident staining the pages, but we can guess from filling in the blanks of his age, and the letters we do have of his name, that this is Thomas Orozco, or Angela's father. It discusses how he was murdered with multiple knife wounds to the neck, and that whoever killed him fled the scene. Angela murdered her father. That's why she suspected her family would be in the graveyard. She had killed them. I and the town, however, agreed that what she did was ultimately justified. While I just spoke of undue judgment only a few moments ago with James, I feel as if the murder of a sexual abuser is always going to be empathetic on some level. We don't even know if it was a murder. It could have been a killing in self-defense. This man makes me too angry to try and extrapolate cultural meaning from his name or to expand on the specifics of him as a person in any regard. He deserves to die unknown. After this, we enter a hallway with newspapers lining every wall. James stops to note that one of them has the day's date on it. This hallway is a representation of Angela's paranoia surrounding the murder, of how she knows that for the rest of her life she will be running until she is caught or she dies. The constant news cycle surrounding it consumes her. Her life will be perpetual paranoia about this all because she couldn't find any other way to escape the sexual abuse she faced. We enter a room made of smooth surfaces, furnished like a living room. Pistons push in and out of the walls. Angela's trauma is recreated even in the room's architecture as she sits in the center being attacked by a creature who looks like a person melded with a bed. This is the Abstract Daddy, the most revolting Silent Hill monster. Though the fight begins with James protecting Angela from the monster, James can't kill it. It's only through a cutscene that occurs where Angela once again takes back the power from her abuser and beats it to death that the thing is finally killed. She uses the TV set as a weapon. The voyeuristic object that her abuser loved so much is now the instrument of his demise. She is now in control. She took back her agency. I cried when I came to this moment in my first playthrough of this game. Here is something so terrible, so grotesque, and so vile that our society often buries. Something that for so many people, nobody cares when it happens. This game just managed it incredibly. I will never not be impressed by how Angela was written. Silent Hill 2 is really special. James ruins this moment by saying something incredibly stupid, as James is wont to do. Get your head out of your ass. Angela takes this as a threat, seeing that she's not in a very good headspace right now, and starts to accuse James of just using her to take advantage of her. She also comes to an interesting conclusion about James during this breakdown, that he got rid of Mary. Her death wasn't incidental. She was somehow removed from his life by his own will. He's lying about her dying of an illness. Isn't that an interesting idea? Angela obviously doesn't know that information for certain. She's just accusing James of that because of her trauma. But still, it plays into a lot of the imagery we've encountered so far about James. About how he saw his wife as a pest, a burden that he had to take care of instead of as a person. Maybe James did get rid of her. After she posits this, she leaves. James briefly refutes the idea before he continues on. I will state once again that this scene, this fight, everything here is really hard for me to discuss, but it is beautiful, and it's part of the reason why I think Silent Hill 2 is a must-play. I just don't have the words for this right now, and I'm not sure I ever will. I hope what I said was enough. After that revelation, our next puzzle first greets us with a room full of corpses standing upright. Each of these corpses has a different description, with all of them being a criminal who is hung for their crimes, yet another instance of judgment and suicide intertwined in the game's text. There is a kidnapper, murderer, arsonist, swindler, robber, and a counterfeiter. In another room, we can find a set of nooses that mirror the position of the corpses in the first room. There are two signs here. One describes the nature of the puzzle, how James must identify the sinless person, and the other is a poem from which you are supposed to ascertain who is truly without sin. Again, James positions himself as the judge, as if he is the one who is able to determine who lives and who dies. Maybe what Angela said wasn't so far off the mark. Something interesting about this puzzle is that no matter the puzzle difficulty or the poem, the murderer will never be the innocent one, again tying back into the idea that maybe James murdered Mary, which Angela put into our heads, and our judgment of him. In the difficulty I have chosen to analyze, the arsonist is the one who is innocent. The arsonist has been wrongly judged by a sheriff who came to town. While this in part is a simple reference to the general inefficacy of law enforcement, it also calls back to how Angela will be wrongfully arrested if she is ever caught. James pulls the noose down when he chooses the right one. It looks almost as if he's going to put it around his head. This drops a key from the ceiling, one that we will be using shortly. The two keys combined look like the Venus symbol, one often associated with women. This connection is pretty clear to me. All of the women in Silent Hill 2 are innocent. They have done no wrong, yet they are all persecuted. Laura is written off as annoying, Mary died of a disease she had no part in getting, or even worse, James ended her life just for being a burden. Maria is used by the town solely as a tool for James's development and has been martyred once to this end, and the only harm Angela has caused was in self-defense, but she is still pursued by society. Women in general are often blamed for the circumstances by the misogynistic hegemony that we live in. Silent Hill 2 is more empathetic to this than any other video game I have ever played that wasn't straight-up autobiographical fiction. It is using this key that James finds another path forward to a ladder to descend even further into the darkness. After we wade through yet another flooded hallway, we come to the other side of the jail cell that Maria was trapped in. Instead of finding her, though, we find her corpse lying on the bed and sprawled across it. We have no idea what actually killed her, but the fact that James didn't see it happen is particularly intriguing to me. Perhaps it is to reflect the fact that James wasn't there for Mary while she was dying. He doesn't deserve the chance to protect Maria because he doesn't deserve a second chance. Or, to bring it back to Angela's accusation of James, perhaps it is a way for his brain to avoid the fact that he got rid of Mary that he doesn't see the way that Maria died. James spends a quiet moment in reflection after this. The way he is positioned above Maria's head is pensive, but also a bit ominous. There is something sinister about staring down into a corpse's eyes like this. The song that plays while we linger in this moment is titled Fermata in Mystic Air. A fermata in sheet music often indicates a pause in the music. Here we see a pause of reflection in our story. That is the less difficult part of this to parse. The mystic air part is the harder one. This is because mystic is spelled with an I and not with a Y. The spelling could refer to a shorthand of místico, an old Spanish vessel, which would indicate a sort of otherworldly, watery feeling to the air. However, I think it's more likely that Yamaoka wanted to invoke a strange feeling with the spelling of mystic that led him to changing it to this. As with all of this game's vibe, there's a mystic and almost fey-like thickness to the air here, and this is but a small pause in that journey accentuated by a bizarre spelling. After that moment of reprieve, we leave Maria behind despite James vocalizing his not truly wanting to. He wants another chance at saving Mary, or at the very least being there for her, even if it's not her. But there's nothing more we can do than leave her behind. The hallways now lead us to a room that appears as a cemetery and almost as if it was outdoors, if it weren't for the fact that we could see the walls and the ceiling. The abstractions of the labyrinth grow more bizarre. This is likely based on the fact that the graveyard is close to the lake and sinking into the swamp slowly but surely, much like Toluca Prison did. We can read the inscriptions on some of the graves in this room. The first one we come across tells us of a felon whose choice of his last supper was ale before he was executed. The idea of facing death without all of our faculties present is a very old one, and also the Last Supper idea of prison ties back into the biblical tone this entire game has. It's interesting that prisons even bother with Last Suppers considering the flagrant disregard for prisoners. Perhaps it's simply another indication of the stranglehold the Christian religion has over the prison industrial complex, even if the Order would rather deny those connections. Another grave found here is Walter Sullivan, the murderer we learned a lot about way earlier in the game. James probably sees himself as comparable to Walter now that the seeds have been planted in his head that he may have been the reason why Mary died. Both have been judged by executioners of the town as well, leading to another connection between the two. The final grave here merely reads, Miriam is an interesting name to place here because it's also connected to Walter Sullivan. The name of one of his infant victims was Miriam, though her last name was Locane. The proximity of the grave to his grave might simply embody that. I am not sure who she could have betrayed though, considering she was an actual baby. Perhaps this Miriam was similarly powerless against the church, blamed wrongly for a crime she couldn't have committed. In this case, not just being an infant though. The most important graves here are in the back of the room, one marked for each of our three protagonists. Eddie and Angela's are already filled, and it's here we learn Eddie's last name, Dombrowski. Dombrowski is a name that indicates Polish heritage due to how common the surname it is anglicized from is in that country. Dabrowski, the name Dombrowski derives from, even being in colloquial names for the Polish national anthem. Maybe Eddie was also bullied for being an immigrant, and that was yet another stepping stone in his path towards social alienation. James's grave is not filled, as I mentioned before, so the only way to go is to jump into it once again, descending even further into the deep darkness. The imagery of James jumping into his own grave is pretty obvious. He is even closer to his own suicide. After the incident with the grave, we drop down into yet another hallway where James must briefly descend further with his own thoughts. This hallway is particularly long, and at the end of it there's a deep red glow with the door, associated with Pyramid Head. Somebody's judgment will be on the other side of this door here. Perhaps James is finally ready to confront the truth that he has buried so well? We open the door to the other side. On the other side, we don't find Pyramid Head. We find a freezing meat locker with Eddie standing in the center of it next to a corpse, his gun still drawn. This area was probably crafted once again from Eddie's own internalization of his torment, Silent Hill drawing upon his subconscious ideas of himself. To him, he is the gluttonous pig that everyone said he was, which is why he's a slab of meat in a locker. The dialogue that James and Eddie have with each other here is extremely uncomfortable. The shots and framings of Eddie changing rapidly with each different aspect Eddie mentions in a jarring and chaotic way. Eddie is honestly probably the scariest character in this entire game beyond any of the monsters. Despite me earlier stating that Eddie's descent into gun violence is a parable I find personally inaccurate to real life, it's still effectively written as something terrifying. The moment that he turns away from James and realizes that James isn't on his side is one of the most tense moments in the game. This initiates a boss fight with Eddie, the first fight with a human directly, not just in Silent Hill 2, but in Silent Hill as a whole. Even taking 3 and 4 into account, the other parts of the original saga, this fight is unique. Sure, in Silent Hill 1 you fight Sybil, but she's being controlled by a parasite at the time. Eddie is completely himself. This is where his path has led him, and it's a very discomforting fight to have. It's his judgment that the door signaled. After taking a certain amount of damage, Eddie runs further into the meat locker and hides from sight as he monologues to James further about his motivations. He ran away to Silent Hill to avoid a crime he committed. He killed a dog, just like Angela killed her abuser. He then states that he and James are the same after James continues to refute Eddie's ideas about killing people. Much like Angela, he clearly sees a darkness in James that James himself doesn't fully realize yet. The guilt he carries over something he did to Mary. To call back to when we first met Eddie in the apartments, he is once again taking the role of the biblical snake in Eden, attempting to tempt James into allowing Eddie to further kill. Surprisingly, whether out of moral strength, unlikely, or total apathy, James does not respond to these temptations. Eddie continues to try to kill James, and the fight grows more tense as he runs around the room and his form dances between the silhouettes of the giant sacks of meat. The green mist gives the whole affair an otherworldly and almost nuclear feel, as if this conflict will destroy both of them, literally or metaphorically. When Eddie finally dies, James says,
I killed a human being.
There's a shock to his voice, both at the act itself and possibly also at his willingness to commit said act. Now that Eddie is out of the story, we know everything about him and what he represented. He was a young man bullied largely for his weight who turned to violence to escape the mockery he faced at every turn. He is a surprisingly empathetic character. What starts out feeling almost as a mean-spirited joke about fat people becomes something heartbreaking in how tense and awful it all feels. Though the connection to young men and gun violence was ill-informed, Eddie Dombrowski is a tragic character. Immediately after this, James gets up and thinks of Mary once again. Much like whatever he did to Mary, he has to completely stop thinking about this entirely and delude himself into believing another narrative. He has to focus on her again. She must be somewhere in this town, right? Ironically, he doesn't remember the thing that brought him here in the first place at this point. After this, if we check the letter in the inventory, it's completely blank. James is slowly forgetting Mary's words. She is becoming a mere concept to him, one that he has to chase in order to give himself purpose. We'll return to this later. When we leave the meat locker, we are outside the Historical Society as if we hadn't gone extremely far underground at all. The abstractions of Silent Hill peaked in the epicenter of the town's history. Now that we are behind the Historical Society on the docks, which we are strictly instructed to keep James off of, perhaps the town is finally growing irritated with his continued presence, we can take a boat to the hotel. James gets on and starts rowing toward the light in the foggy distance, signaling where the hotel is. It's a very mystical passage across the water, again a journey over to the spirit world as bodies of water are so often intended to portray. After many minutes of listless rowing toward the light with no means of telling the time, we reach the dock on the other side of the lake. James has made safe passage to the underworld by heading into the light and crossing the river Styx, and now he will receive his fate.
You see it too. For me, it's always like this.
When we arrive at the Lakeview Hotel, there are two things worth noting. First, James says that the place hasn't changed at all in 3 years. That means the same year Mary died in his delusion was also the same year she got sick. Perhaps their actual visit was 3 years ago, but she only died within the past year, as Laura corroborates. The fact that it's a picture-perfect recreation of the place on the day she got sick is eerie, a snapshot of a memory. Second of all, it looks exactly like the building in the Burning Man drawing. So was the hotel burned down? Our hangman puzzle says arsonists are innocent, so perhaps James didn't have anything to do with it, but still, how is the hotel in such good shape after that event? It probably is, then, just a crystallized memory. As we explore the exterior of the hotel, we can find a dried-up fountain with a music box beside it. The music box is for the Little Mermaid, fitting as the Little Mermaid is both seen as an idyllic fairy tale, as James wants to remember his marriage, but it's also a story where a woman who deeply loves someone ends up dying at the end in a grim way. The dried-up fountain is a haunting reference to this. There's no more water for our Little Mermaid, and there's no more life either. The fact that the fountain is in the shape of a bird is also of some interest to me. Birds are very frail and delicate creatures, beautiful in their ability to fly, much like the angelic Mary. Upon entering the hotel, we can find the map of the area with the phrase, "Waiting for you," written on the room that James and Mary stayed in. Of course, this mirrors her role in the hospital as well. All Mary could do was wait for James to come and visit her again in a single lonely room. After we descend a staircase to a lower floor, once again going deep into the darkness, we can find a can of thinner in an elevator. I'm not entirely sure what the thinner is supposed to represent at this point. In an extremely tenuous sense, it could be that James's own life feels like it's thinning. That as the further we get into the town, the further his suicidality increases, but that's honestly rather silly and feels kind of disrespectful to those ideas. Perhaps it really is just thinner. We stumble upon a vase here as well. While not critical to progression, it's something that James can examine. The fact that James doesn't find the vase useful now is fascinating. James is right, the vase is no longer useful to him. Symbolically, vases often represent the hopes one has for a relationship. James's relationship is already over. There's no hope left for that. Back on the first floor, in one room we can find mannequins once again. Their presence is probably due to James associating them with Mary and Mary being associated with the hotel. They also appeared in the apartments where he and Mary lived. As we know, James objectified Mary in many ways. The mannequins come back to symbolize this once more, possibly to show how he has turned Mary into a MacGuffin in his quest to find her in Silent Hill. It's also possibly because the apartments and the hotel are where James has her at her most idealized. Those were the good times he had with Mary. Another room on the first floor is the piano room. Here we can hear someone playing the piano, which turns out to be Laura hiding from James. We didn't see her at all in the labyrinth because she had nothing that she needed to explore. As I said before, she's still a child. There's no twisting mindscape of guilt and trauma for her to deal with. She lost Mary, which was most likely traumatic to some degree, but that's all that's happened that we know of. Of course, since she and James are both looking for her, it's only natural that they both ended up in the same spot. This is yet another reason people think that Laura might not have existed before the town. Again, I think Laura not being human is a stupid theory that frankly doesn't make any sense. Even regardless of whether or not it makes sense, it's just not an interesting take on the story anyway. Once again, James scares Laura in this interaction. To her, he's the only monster in the town. The two of them have a short discussion about where Mary might be in the hotel before James straight up lies to Laura and tells her that he has no clue where she might be. Dude, it's literally marked on your map. Laura then says that it was in the letter that Mary wrote to her, and in a rare moment of vulnerability, she gives the letter to James to read. Interestingly, she tells James not to tell her and Mary's nurse because she stole it from the nurse's locker. Their nurse was named Rachel, which is a Hebrew name meaning ewe. Not ewe as in gross, ewe as in sheep. Perhaps the nurse was like one of the followers of Mary, someone who spread her word to Laura after her death, despite it being inadvertent, of course. In the letter, we learn some things that we have suspected all along. The first being that James was never kind to Mary in front of Laura, leading to Laura knowing about his abusive tendencies. There's also the fact that Mary wanted to adopt Laura. The puzzle pieces of our speculation come together here as Laura draws her prickly cat once again on the fog and the sliding glass door, cutting through our own confusion with her fingertips. Laura's Christ, and James refuses her forgiveness by treating her like a pest. But seriously, I'm pretty sure that's the allegory they're going with there. The two of them start to speculate on what the quiet, beautiful place Mary was referring to in the letter was. It was obviously heaven, of course, but they seem to be under the impression it must be a physical place. After all, they were both called here by her. It's not a totally unreasonable thing to ascertain. Silent Hill mixes the real and the unreal, the afterlife and the life we live today in a blend once more. Laura claims to have had another letter from Mary on her person, but she has somehow lost it. Important words lost in the fog of memory again. Once Laura leaves to go find that other letter with little resistance from James, we can explore the restless dining area. If we take a closer look at the piano, James has something to say about it.
There's a piano here. I remember how much Mary liked to play piano. She wasn't very good, but I still love to hear her play. That was so long ago, before we were even married. Why am I thinking of that now?
Learning that Mary played piano before they were married, but not after, is an interesting choice. Pianos are often symbols of romance. There was something lost about the relationship when they got married. Even though there was still love between them, the romantic aspect just wasn't there anymore. Perhaps James chose to associate this memory as being prior to marriage because he personally thought some spark was lost between them. We know that Mary still loves James, but James holds a lot of weird resentment for her. The last thing to note in this room is a plate with a knife and a fork on either side, with only a fish key on top of it. Maybe it's tied to a specific memory James had while staying there, one where he and Mary went on a dinner date in this very dining room, and he was disappointed with the serving sizes of the food. And their price, of course. Somehow, it's a path forward. We leave this room. Here we come to one of my biggest criticisms of Silent Hill 2 as a game. Again, I don't like to make value statements much. I don't find them very interesting as a form of critique, but I can't imagine it was in any good taste at all to make the abstract daddy a regular enemy in the hotel. I'm not sure what it's supposed to represent, and it feels like they're just reusing them for the sake of reusing an enemy without even realizing how gross it is. That moment with Angela in the labyrinth is one of the most powerful things I've ever seen in a video game, and I think that by making the creature from it into a normal enemy, you're doing a massive disservice to it. It just doesn't make any sense to me. We use the fish key to get the key to hotel room 204 out of a briefcase. A link between the fish and business in Silent Hill. Along with the coal mine, it might be the main form of profit the town has. I mean, there is a giant lake right next to them. Perhaps this is another way that the colonists defiled Silent Hill, the commercialization of the town's natural resources for the sake of profit motive. In a reading room in the hotel, we can find an open book. This book is especially pertinent to James, and what he says about it is heart-wrenching.
There's a book open on top of the desk. It looks like a medical book. I've already read enough medical books. None of them ever did any good.
It's a reminder that James, despite all the horrible things he did and felt about Mary, still tried his best. At least up until the end, if what Angela said is true. It's still a crushing thing to read. There was somehow no known way to cure Mary, yet another instance of the plague being somehow divine in nature. In room 204, we find a key to the service elevator. It's also here we can find a photo covered in black ink. The contents of the photo don't matter much, but the fact that we use the paint thinner to cut through and see the message on the other side is interesting to me. The thinner is another way for James to cut through the fog in his mind. The void of obfuscation is being removed by it, so that's its purpose. The code is randomly generated, but there are a set of words it can be. Most relate to the game in pretty obvious ways, love or dark being references to James' particular journey through the town. One that strikes me as really interesting, though, is Mama. Did Angela find this puzzle? Is she in the hotel? That's what she calls her mother, after all. Inside the briefcase, we find another music box, this time Cinderella. Another fairy tale involving falling in love, complete with a gruesome turn that it is not often associated with anymore due to Disney's adaptation taking the fore in the public consciousness. There was no happily ever after for James and Mary, though, even though there was one for Cinderella and the prince in both versions. The only way we can really go now is to check the service elevator out, but it refuses to work for James. It's only when we read the sign that says the wait is one person that it becomes clear. James must give up all of his possessions and his inventory by putting them in a locker in order for the elevator to work for him. It's an interestingly disempowering part and sort of a sequel to the trek across Toluca Lake. There's something spiritual about elevators, about the way they feel as if they're a portal to another floor. And when you die, you need to leave everything you had behind. James's unique disempowerment adds to this feeling even more. What we will find on the other side of this elevator will be difficult to manage. Of course, connections can also be made to the weighing of the heart and feather by Anubis. This is yet another time James is judged, though somehow he passes this judgment. Perhaps it is because he himself is still not aware of his crime. On this basement level, we can enter a storage room to immediately find another music box. This one is around some apples, obviously hinting towards who it is, Snow White, who ate a poisoned apple in her story. There's something to be said about her being in a food storage room. She, too, was stored in a glass coffin, preserved in a ghoulish manner to be awakened later. Though I wouldn't call food preservation grotesque, I would describe it as necessary. I do find the similarity interesting. Of course, there's also the similarity of Mary waiting in her hospital bed for James, her own glass coffin. Except the most tragic thing about that was that she wasn't dead. She was alive the entire time and had to sit there thinking about him and everything else in her life that was going on, waiting on a prince that would never truly come back to her. In another room, the staff office, we can find the videotape that James and Mary made together on their first visit to the hotel. This crystallized memory that we can hold in our hand was forgotten by James back at the hotel, possibly a sign of his greater memory loss issues. We will be coming back to the contents of this tape if we ever get the chance to play it on anything, but for now we just keep it with us, guarding this sacred memory they shared. There is also a can opener with the videotape in the safe here that we grab, possibly to represent the can of worms watching that tape will open. A fascinating small detail we can find in the staff lounge is that the schedules are all from a year ago. It's an interesting detail that paints James and Mary's visit to Silent Hill even more recently. She must have become ill just after visiting the town and was hospitalized immediately. She died a year after that, and since it's been a year since she got sick, that means she must not have died very long ago at all. Why did James choose to hide this from us? From himself? In the kitchen connected directly to the bar, we can use a can opener in order to find a can full of light bulbs. It's an extremely dreamlike image. I take it as the way that happiness has been commodified and mass-produced. We buy cans full of lights in our lives in order to find purpose that has been ordained by capitalist marketing firms. We are told by the sway of industry what we want, and it's always what's most useful to them. We enter the bar from the kitchen. When we examine the counter, James once again has some interesting commentary to make.
The counter. Mary and I shared some nice drinks together at this bar. Sometimes it seems like so long ago, and sometimes it's just as if it were yesterday.
I have no meaningful commentary or analysis on this particular quote. It just makes me sad. We can also examine some lures in here to learn the shocking truth that James is not very good at fishing. This is another way that he is disconnected from the town, from this place. He doesn't participate in their local traditions. He is an outsider, one who hasn't engaged with its ecosystem in any regard. Perhaps that is why it has such a strong effect on him. He didn't make himself part of the town when he visited, and so its culture is foreign to him, and that is uniquely powerful. He has no knowledge of what to expect. We screw the light bulb into a lamp to point a light to the path forward, allowing James to unlock the door in front of him, this facsimile of truth still allowing him some grain of motivation to push forward. It's through here that we find ourselves back in the main area of the hotel. After that brief journey through the underworld, we can return upstairs to the service elevator and reclaim all the things that we had to give up to seek passage there. In the center of the lobby there is a music maker, but it requires the 3 music boxes to be set into it. The dark fairy tale of James and Mary's married life comes to mind once more as they are set in. What was promised as a happily ever after was just 2 young adults trying to make things work the best they could, though the grim ending was maintained. Now we can finally go to the room where Mary claims to be waiting for us. Room 312, the room that James and Mary stayed in together when they first visited Silent Hill. When we enter the room, there's no sign of Mary. It's completely empty. The only accompaniment James has is the bright white light pouring in, an almost angelic indication of the rapture that is about to come. James puts the videotape in the VCR here. It starts out as a simple taping of the trip they had together. Mary is positioned against the bright light again. The images that flickered of her when we first met Maria are displayed here again. We see the full tape this time. Mary teases James for taping again and talks about how Silent Hill used to be some kind of sacred place, which is something we've explored quite a bit already. Then she starts coughing. The tape begins to distort at the sight of her illness, James's memories fully coming back through that signifier, and becomes something far worse. Mary is shown sitting in bed. Her skin is covered in something which ties us back to the Rosewater Park connection. Mary's illness did something to her skin, and rosewater was often used as something to treat skin conditions. That is not the focus of this, though. James leans over her head and gives her a kiss. This action is suspiciously similar to James staring at Maria's corpse in Labyrinth, right above her head. Then, James smothers Mary to death with a pillow. Mary didn't die 3 years ago, or even 1 year ago. She died within the last week, or even the day this takes place, and it was all his fault. I feel as if this conclusion was evident. James saw Mary as a burden and saw her as something he needed to get rid of. Angela even explicated that James had gotten rid of Mary in some way. The person he loved most, the person that he was supposed to help get through her disease. He killed her. Mary's last moments were alone and afraid and betrayed, and she didn't know what was going on. It would be one thing if it were assisted suicide. It wasn't. It was fucking murder. She's dead now, and it's James's fault. It's interesting to me that Angela and Eddie are associated with guns and knives, both weapons that kill people, yet they've not committed any evil acts themselves. But James? He's associated with pillows. His strange yet unassuming nature and clouded memory belied the crime that he has been judging himself for the entire time. He keeps on changing his outlook and acting strange. Hell, the letter he got even erased itself because killing Eddie reminded him of this, all due to one simple factor. He killed his fucking wife in cold blood. He sees himself as Pyramid Head because he thinks he is fit to judge whether others can live or die. He thinks that he is a person who can decide if someone wants death, that someone deserves to die when they haven't done anything to indicate as much. Again, this was not assisted suicide, as some fans might say. This was the twisted, personal judgment of a single sick fuck. Something of interest to bring up here is that initially during this scene, Mary was supposed to scream audibly, but it's not in the final game. The cut screams are in the game files. They're so visceral and uncomfortable to listen to that I think it was best that they were cut. Besides, the silence speaks so much more. Murder is often a quiet act, someone slipping away into death. It fits with the gentleness of the pillow, hiding an ugliness behind it, as well as showing how murder is usually not some melodramatic struggle for life. In many ways, James and the Order are similar in this regard. As we saw in the Historical Society, both want to pretend they are good, want to hide the harm they have caused to others. Both are incredibly misogynistic entities, with a huge chunk of the Order's abuse being towards a little girl, who was even killed directly by one of their most important figures, that hide behind a veneer of plainness that people find mysterious and kind of unassumingly stupid. James's delusion he crafted, which was reinforced by his repetitive tick of moving his hand to his head, was a cloudy shield that led to nobody ever taking him seriously. Much like how many leaders of the Order dressed and acted in such a way that nobody would take them seriously. They have both crafted deliberate narratives of disbelief, and this leads into yet another theme of duality that the game tackles, the differences between the two versions of James. The Jack Torrance-esque wife murderer, and the strange, distorted man who is simply lost. Each is an incredibly different person, and one doesn't remember the other. The song that plays is simply called True. James sitting down in the chair looking at his feet is a very visually striking image as the camera swings around him. It also reminds of the scene with Maria in the labyrinth. The television screen is now static, much like his thoughts must be. He can no longer hide from himself. The hotel is the center of memory. It is then that Laura bursts into the room and we receive divine judgment from her. The way she's framed against the window is similar to Mary in the tape. Both are angelic figures, and James is never framed with this almost holy light behind him. Laura doesn't believe James when he informs her that Mary is dead, and he killed her. Naturally, she's pretty fucking pissed off about this, and she leaves before James can apologize to her. When he slumps in his chair, it's eerily reminiscent of the pose that his corpse was in the apartments, watching the television there. It's here he seems to lose all hope, but then he hears Mary's voice beckoning him once again. For some reason, the town isn't done with us yet, even though we found the truth it desperately wanted us to see. After we leave the hotel room, the hotel changes. It becomes decrepit and dark. It's no longer the perfect facsimile we saw when we entered. It's now the hotel that is truly a year later. The one that burned down, rotting wood and all. The crystallized, sublime, and saccharine memory gives way to the horrible truth that he has brought upon himself. The song that now plays throughout the hotel is titled Black Fairy, in reference to the dark fairy tale that the hotel has been building up to. We now know that their unhappy ending wasn't simply Mary's death, it was James murdering her. Their traditional happy ending never happened because James took her life. She turned to Seafoam because he didn't love her, only saw her as a burden to be removed. If we return to the small reading room in the hotel once again where there was a medical book, we can now find a pair of headphones. As I explored earlier with the radio, audio devices are often seen as uniquely spiritual and connected to the afterlife. James puts on the headphones and begins to listen to a conversation he had with the doctor before Mary passed away. This discussion is heartbreaking. As it pans out to show an empty hospital bed, James and the doctor argue about the disease that Mary had. It's untreatable, as we gathered before. The doctor says Mary has between 3 years and 6 months left to live. James's specific 3 years number must have derived from this interaction. In spite of how much James obviously cared in his talk he had with the doctor, he still clearly saw Mary as something to get rid of. And that's utterly monstrous. With that tragic scene out of our minds, another interesting aspect of this section of the hotel is a representation of James's own scattered mind. There are 3 doors that I can only think to describe as, and forgive me for saying this, Scooby-Doo doors. This is because you enter one of them and you come out the other, and it's seemingly random. These 3 doors are a really fascinating representation of James's mental state to me. He's spiraling rapidly after learning the truth, his coping mechanism of forgetfulness completely shattered. We can now enter the elevator, but it only descends into the basement, once again reflecting James's own descent as it has so many times before. This time it is not into truth, but into despair. As it goes down, it fills with water. The hotel must have flooded when it burned down, weighing James and his sins down even further as he wades through it. His guilt has become personified once more, but not as a violent threat, as heavy water he has to make his way through. As we find a way up to the top floor, we come across a staircase that's on fire. There are 2 corpses on the wall, sewn in flesh, framed as portraits of bad memories. Angela is standing on it. These 2 must be the 2 that she killed in self-defense. This must be her hell. The hotel still burning down all around her just as she feels her life is falling apart. It's at this moment that she turns to James and starts calling him her mother. It's something that comes off a little random right now. What about James makes her think that he's her mother? It probably simply has to do with what's going on around her. The life that she's been maintaining ever since she ran away is now burning to the ground. She latches on to the one idea she's had the entire time, finding her mother. After she realizes that James is not, in fact, her mother, she starts to lash out at him. James tries to convince her that suicide isn't the answer once again, but Angela responds poorly. It's not that simple. She's not just going to get better through James telling her platitudes. She illustrates this before she leaves to go up the stairs, mocking the fact that he thinks there are any heroes in mental health. James, the ever-clouded man, points out that it's hot as hell in there. Angela turns around and merely says,
You see it too. For me, it's always like this.
before she ascends up the stairs. The song that plays, the reprise of the game's main theme, drones on. It's interesting that this reprise's variation of the main melody from the original song is sort of subdued. Angela's story is muted, it's not in focus. She's not the main character of Silent Hill 2, and we are not entitled to know her story, which leads into so much I love about Angela. Angela is one of my favorite fictional characters of all time. Her story of someone who killed her abuser and had to run away from that, and the ultimate guilt and anxiety and depression she was left with due to all of those experiences is utterly phenomenal in how it was handled. The way she talks, the way she acts, the way she isn't solved by simple, meaningless, nice phrases, or even solved by anything. Angela is in pain, and the best part is that we're not owed the end of her story. She could have died. The imagery of her ascending up the staircase certainly brings to mind someone going up to heaven. But we will never truly know what happens to her. There is no reason for us to. She has taken away the agency from the player. We are not entitled to know everything that happens to her and be the people who permanently watch her. Angela deserves nothing but the best. Now that we're past what I consider one of the most emotionally powerful scenes in the game, we're nearing the end. James ascends up the stairs, following that same almost angelic and forgiving imagery that the angel Angela did, and through the flames. There's only the final stretch to talk about now.
James, you made me happy.
It's after the scene of the fire that James is now in an even more decrepit version of the hotel than the one he was in before. It's almost unfinished, caution tape is everywhere, and water drips from the ceiling even more frequently than before. As we walk through the abstracted environments, we eventually encounter the final save point in the game, which is actually 9 save points arranged in a square. As we all know, the save point is reflective in this game, and this arrangement creates an interesting abstracted image we can't really see, but we can imagine. James is being reflected in these once again, but now he is shattered. There are several save points all reflecting his different body parts, but they never come together, still disparate due to the lines between. There is no real connection between any part of him. Raskolnikov's game has been broken. On the other side of the door, we finally encounter 2 pyramid heads, each wielding spears, and Maria hanging upside down, almost in a crucifixion pose. The 2 pyramid heads once again kill Maria as their counterpart killed Mary, this time even faster, and this time making the Spear of Longinus connection even more biblically prominent. Maria died for James's sins. The 2 pyramid heads jump down as James monologues exactly about what they mean in relation to him, and honestly, this monologue is really stupid, I'm sorry. I think it's really weird for him to explain a major part of the game out loud to the audience like this, especially when it's really not that subtle. On a better note, the 2 pyramid heads flanking James is an interesting reference back to the hieroglyph we saw back in the prison. Judgment is finally coming for him. Anyway, this begins the final boss fight against the two Pyramid Heads, where we can finally defeat them. Their purpose has been served as guides to the truth. They no longer need to be around. When they die, they both freeze in a position that is reminiscent as well of the crucifixion. Judgment becomes judged. The song that plays is called Betrayal. These two Pyramid Heads going against James, and his defeat of them is yet another betrayal of himself against himself, but it's not a bad thing in the slightest. To move past his entitled, self-righteous judgment, he has to defeat the image of it that has guided him here for that sole reason. They both hold small eggs, one scarlet, one rust-colored. They're both required to move past this room, both representing new beginnings as they are eggs. Eggs are babies, they're hatched to start new lives. And now James is ready to start his own new life since he was reborn through his acceptance of the truth and defeat of both his guide and suicidality. But there's still one last thing he has to deal with after this. Scarlet represents the passion he felt for Mary, that color being one often associated with love, while rust represents the scars of time that the relationship did not survive through, the way it aged and the way that James took that aging to commit murder. All because he thought he was fit to judge. When we exit this fight, however, the hotel is once again like a hotel. It once again maintains the illusion. Perhaps the final confrontation is trying to be a little easy on us. As we follow the paths that the game has outlined for us, one door we encounter has something particularly peculiar on the front of it. It appears to have a person's face etched into it in deep, deep pain. It brings to mind instances of such faces appearing on floors in real life, supposedly as products of hauntings. James's own mind sees Mary as haunting him even now, even after he has learned the truth. He sees the pain that he put her through, the ultimate betrayal written all over her screaming face. He soldiers on past this door deeper into the hotel, though if we look on the map, the doors we go through should lead us outside the hotel and onto the balcony. It doesn't. A long, long, long hallway stretches out in front of James. Another place for us to catch our thoughts as we walk through it, or so it initially seems. Instead, we are not allowed asylum from James's guilt. The truth is out, and now we are being even more appropriately punished than before. As we go through the long hallway, we are assaulted by an argument the two of them had before she died while she was in the hospital. Much like her namesake, Mary yelled at James, though it's completely understandable considering she was on her deathbed and faced with her own impending mortality. She lashes out at him, but then asks him to come back for her. It's inconsistent, messy, hurtful. Most of all, it's beautifully, painfully real. And it won't let you have your quiet walk through this hallway to reflect on how far you've come, James. You made your choice and you have to live with it. After that painful stretch, James once again ascends. He ascends up scaffolding in the unfinished remains of the hotel, water all below him, almost threatening that his guilt could drown him at any point, literally or figuratively. This is reinforced by the fact that the further you go up the stairs, the more they vanish behind you. There is no turning back from this final confrontation, lest he end it all. Face the one you hurt or die. He climbs the stairs higher and higher, ascending further and further to meet Mary in heaven. It's time to finish. At the top of the stairs, we find Mary. She is lying in a bed in the center of the room, much like she would have in the hospital. She was waiting for us the entire time. She begins to chastise James for not finding her sooner and questions if he even wanted to find her. After all, he did spend a lot of time with Maria. She especially questions the fact that he fucking killed her, which, good on her. Ultimately, James gives in to the safety net of Maria. He did spend a lot of time with her after all, and he constantly protected her. He checked on her a lot in the hospital, and he went to see her corpse more than once in the labyrinth. No wonder this manifestation of Mary is upset. James wants a weird, horny facsimile of her, and only ever saw Mary as an obstacle to that. Fuck him. Maria transforms into an interesting monster almost reminiscent of the fleshlets in its design, which makes sense. It's another abstraction of her hospital bed. She herself, however, becomes something that looks like a nun in the bed. One last image of Mary as the Virgin Mother before we kill her. A combination of James's perceived purity of Mary and the fact that he thinks her disliking him for, murdering her is unreasonable. God, fuck James Sunderland. The arena of the boss fight is similar to the grates we find throughout the town, once again indicating that James is very close to the edge. Mary has two attacks, one where she attacks James with a tentacle, perhaps a literal representation of how James saw her as lashing out on her deathbed, and the other attack is her firing a bundle of moths at James. These moths are Mary, the ever-changing and ever-reborn figure, yet plain and frail. After an unremarkable battle, Mary finally dies, the last attack being dealt while she is helpless and motionless lying on the floor. James has killed her again. Way to fucking go, dude. Once we deal the final blow, we cut to James outside Rosewater Park, where James first met Maria, though this time, he is the one standing there alone. He looks into the lake and suddenly we hear Maria's voice again. She asks James if he's killed Mary again, which is a fucking ghoulish thing to say. The interaction is completely disgusting. The camera even hangs low on the floor, almost as if it's ashamed of these two as much as we are. James and Maria discuss how he's over the wife he murdered now, and that he just needs to move on from it. Maria gives James a letter that Mary apparently wrote. I don't blame Maria for her circumstances. Being invented for the whims of a man and knowing nothing outside of them is horrible, but her being the messenger of Mary's letter after her death is just grotesque. The letter is read out, revealing it to be the rest of the letter from Mary at the beginning of the game. I won't discuss the letter for now. The two of them walk to James's car and James notices Maria coughing and tells her to do something about it. The town is cyclical, drawing James in once more through Maria's illness just as Mary's. The song that plays throughout the credits is known as Promise, simply referring to James's promise to Mary that he would return someday. And he did. He will continue to return there as many times as it takes for him to stop filling the void with other people, as many cycles of murder and replacement that takes. It's interesting because the Promise song is associated with Angela. Much like Theme of Laura, the non-reprise version is the main story, but the reprises are Angela's, who is, to be frank, the true emotional protagonist of the tale. And she has been vindicated in every terrible thing that she has said about James. Silent Hill 2 is ultimately a tale of deterministic self-judgment. One man who sees himself fit to decide who should live over and over and fills the voids they leave behind as quickly as possible with more to exert his whims on. James Sunderland is a ghoulish, horrible man who... At the top of the stairs, we find Mary. Or that's what we think at first. After she gets mad at us for confusing her with Mary once again, it's revealed that Maria was the one waiting for us up here all along. Mary is dead. Maria is not. This is the ultimate test of James against the facsimile. It's interesting that he doesn't just give in to her here, possibly another indication of his conscience actually fighting him. Perhaps if he had made different choices, he would have. Maria turns into a monster and a boss fight commences. Even though I have yet to explain it to you, I get the feeling you already know what all this means. In spite of everything, I feel bad that Maria has to be put down for James's sake. One last misogynistic punch his psyche gives us. Once we deal the final blow, the game fades into the bedroom that James and Mary shared, with James sitting in a chair at Mary's side. Whether or not this is an apparition of Mary or her actual ghost speaking with him is something that is up to our interpretation, though I'm not sure it much matters. This scenario, whether it's invented by the town or James's own mind, is a way for James to finally speak to Mary and ask her for forgiveness, what she thinks he should do. After all, the victim should have the final say in these things. He tries to justify it as assisted suicide, which is asinine, but Mary eventually tells James that he suffered enough for killing her. He can rest now. Her judgment is the only one that matters here. She was the one who was murdered. He raises her hand to his cheek for one final time, then carries her out of the room with him. We hear the starting of a car engine as James starts to realize the real reason he came to this town. It was to kill himself. It all makes sense. How little regard he had for his own life, how often he studied Angela's knife in the inventory. Pyramid Head's entire existence can be suicidal ideation for him. There's so much to indicate that James just wants to die for what he's done, and Mary has finally given him that reprieve. Masahiro Ito has stated that Mary's corpse was in the back of James's car at this moment, which is why James carried her out with him. They're together at the bottom of Toluca Lake now, some kind of twisted romance. Before all this happened, Mary gave James the rest of her letter from the beginning of the game, with water filling the screen, drowning us in James's guilt instead of us wading through it as we have so many times before. The letter is read out. I won't discuss the letter for now. The track Angels Thanatos plays as we look at the tranquil, calm waters of the end. Thanatos is the Greek god of death, and so his angel is one that would bring life's ultimate conclusion. In some ways, this could be James. He killed Mary, saw it as some kind of divine salvation from her condition because he's a stupid piece of shit. In other ways, it could be Mary, who is the one who judged James for him and told him when it would all be over, when he could finally kill himself. Silent Hill 2 is a tale about doing your best in life, struggling to keep your head above water, and ultimately how that can fail to happen. It's a very human story, and here is its human end. James Sunderland is a revolting and ultimately tired man who... At the top of the stairs, we find Mary. It's actually not her this time, Maria masquerading identically as her. I feel as if I don't really need to talk about this or the fight afterward for some reason. Once we deal the final blow, we are placed in James and Mary's bedroom, speaking with what appears to be the actual Mary, the one who James killed. They discuss the murder, but eventually Mary forgives James. She takes a positive reading of him. Much like in life, she continues to be a saint. She gives him a letter and she asks him to do one more thing for her. We cut to the graveyard near Silent Hill where the letter is read out. I won't discuss the letter for now. James and Laura enter into frame, the implication being that James adopted her just as Mary had wanted to. Both the Virgin and Christ have shown forgiveness to James for his actions, in spite of the fact that I really think they shouldn't have. It is ultimately Mary's choice that matters the most, even if I personally find it objectionable. While she is not a real person, obviously, the fact that the game focuses so much on this choice is what makes me come to this conclusion. I'm sure if Mary told James to kill himself, he would have, but I don't think James really wanted to kill himself, or even really wanted Maria. He ignored Maria in the constant clouded search for his wife, poor Maria, and took really good care of himself throughout the entirety of his trip through the town. Now, James has a chance to start over and become a better person. The victory laurel of Laura's approval has been acquired by him. This is the overdose delusion given by the song's name. This happy ending is almost dreamlike, as if it were a hallucination you'd have after overdosing. After everything that's happened, Mary and Laura forgave James. James Sunderland is a man who has done some horrible things, but by doing his best, I think he can... Let's talk about this letter. I normally really don't like doing this, but I think it's important to hear the whole thing play out. The entire thing. It's one of the best pieces of voice acting I've ever listened to in my life.
In my restless dreams, I see that town. Silent Hill. You promised you'd take me there again someday, but you never did. Well, I'm alone there now, in our special place, waiting for you. Waiting for you to come to see me. But you never do. And so I wait, wrapped in my cocoon of pain and loneliness. I know I've done a terrible thing to you, something you'll never forgive me for. I wish I could change that, but I can't. I feel so pathetic and ugly laying here, waiting for you. Every day I stare up at the cracks in the ceiling, and all I can think about is how unfair it all is. The doctor came today. He told me I could go home for a short stay. It's not that I'm getting better. It's just that this may be my last chance. I think you know what I mean. Even so, I'm glad to be coming home. I've missed you terribly. But I'm afraid, James. I'm afraid you don't really want me to come home. Whenever you come see me, I can tell how hard it is on you. I don't know if you hate me or pity me, or maybe I just disgust you. I'm sorry about that. When I first learned that I was going to die, I just didn't want to accept it. I was so angry all the time, and I struck out at everyone I loved most. Especially you, James. That's why I understand if you do hate me. But I want you to know this, James. I'll always love you. Even though our life together had to end like this, I still wouldn't trade it for the world. We had some wonderful years together. Well, this letter has gone on too long, so I'll say goodbye. I told the nurse to give this to you after I'm gone. That means that as you read this, I'm already dead. I can't tell you to remember me, but I can't bear for you to forget me. These last few years since I became ill, I am so sorry for what I did to you, did to us. You've given me so much, and I haven't been able to return a single thing. That's why I want you to live for yourself now. Do what's best for you, James. James, you made me happy.
It's hard for me to say what this letter truly is, other than a simple capstone to the entire game. We saw it across all three endings, across all three choices. Whether or not James chose Maria or killed himself or adopted Laura and made a new life for himself, there is one constant between all of them. Mary loved him. Mary cared for him. Even though James Sunderland was a disgusting and vile person, she still had love in her heart for him. And it's just really, really tragic to think about. The person she loved most in the whole world betrayed her when she was alone and afraid at her most vulnerable. Silent Hill 2 is a story about people doing the best they can with terrible circumstances. There is no happy ending. There is only what is, and what the characters have tried their best to overcome. For some characters, we simply aren't entitled to what has happened. Others died horrible deaths. Some will be stuck in this place forever returning. Others move on with their lives. As Pianissimo Epilogue plays, know that no matter what choices you made, nothing will ever truly be okay. And that's okay.
You look so peaceful. Forgive me for waking you.
Well, actually, there is one more thing that we can try. Something that only becomes available to you after you've beaten Silent Hill 2 in your own desperation to try and find a better ending. You could try to use the occult magic of the town to bring her back to life. On a second playthrough of Silent Hill 2, there are 4 objects you can find scattered throughout the town. Each one of these objects will give James the knowledge to try and perform a ritual to resurrect Mary. Now that James knows the town, or rather the player taking over the body of James, he has the ability to ignore everything that isn't relevant to this goal and seek out these objects. It's absolutely you forcing the game to try and get the best ending. So, what are these objects? The first object we find in the apartments is the white chrism. A chrism is an oil that is typically associated with anointing someone religiously, and due to the racist undertones of that white coloration, perhaps this would have been seen as some kind of purifying anointment by the Order. Maybe one for reversing death, anointment into life. Its presence in the apartments is also something worth noting. Domestic life contains a way to return to that same existence from the beyond. The prisonic fairy tale of our Sisyphean day-to-day tasks will always find a way to rope you back in. Our next object is in the gas station where we found the lead pipe. This is a book titled Lost Memories, which brings to light a lot of interesting things about the nature of Silent Hill as a town. Lost Memories is found in a newspaper dispenser, which is a strange choice because it's not news, it's the opposite. It's a book about the lost past of the town, which is both pertinent to the town itself and to James, who had lost his own past at this point. It's here we learn about the indigenous people who once lived in the Silent Hill area and how they were driven out by colonists. I don't really find the stereotype of dead natives being part of the mysticism of a place very interesting at all, but due to the nature of the game and how it discusses more the aspects of their suffering than how their beliefs tie back to the lore, it's hard for me to see it as that bad. However, I am a white person with no native ancestry, so my opinion is fairly irrelevant here. With that being said, I'm certain that the lost memories in the book are going to be used as some kind of power source for the rituals, so that's not great. Within the Silent Hill Historical Society, we can find an obsidian goblet, another key to the ritual. Assumedly, due to how so much of the town is rooted in Mesoamerican myth, this would have been taken from how several Mesoamerican cultures have been found to have artistic depictions of obsidian as symbolism for the act of self-sacrifice. This connection makes even more sense when you consider that the prison, a place full of sacrificial imagery, had some previous Mesoamerican connections beforehand through the art pieces there. Perhaps there is some amount of sacrifice that has to be made in the bid to resurrect Mary. It would make sense, after all. You are quite literally bringing someone back to life. One life for another, James giving back the life he took, which won't undo what he did, but it might start to make things better. And it is with this that the Aztec connections throughout the game start to make more sense. Even though Silent Hill was much further north than any Mesoamerican society, the Aztec culture was very concerned with sacrifice and self-sacrifice on the whole, as they saw that it was human sacrifice that made the world continue moving. In some ways, the journey through Silent Hill is its own sacrifice. Be able to continue living your life at the cost of making it through the dangerous town, learn how to cope with your own trauma through your personal journey. In some instances, people do lose their lives here. James does in one instance, and Eddie always does. And in the first outing to the town, Sybil has the opportunity to lose her life as well. Silent Hill is a potentially life-ending, sacrificial, and divine journey, and so that's why I believe so much of the imagery in this game ties back to Aztec beliefs. The final piece we need for this ritual is a book in the reading room in the hotel. It's known only as the Crimson Ceremony, a name that obviously evokes some blood-based ritual considering the color of blood and how often it is associated with occult magic. This book contains instructions on how to summon the Crimson One, an abstract old god of the town. Before this, we haven't really been given names to associate with the old gods of Silent Hill. They just were. Crimson One is an interesting choice, not only because it connects back to the ceremony, but also because of the term Crimson King. The term Crimson King refers to a monarch known for the amount of bloodshed they cause throughout their reign, so we can probably assume this god is not good news. After the defeat of the Maria boss fight one more time, James rose out into the center of Toluca Lake, the spiritual epicenter of the town, complete with a church on the island. He waxes about how the town's occult magic can be used to resurrect Mary, about how he can't live without her anymore. The screen fades to black. There is no resolution. This is your payment for trying to cheat past the endings of Silent Hill, to try and give yourself an unambiguous, happy conclusion. There are no victories in Silent Hill. No matter what leg you think you have up on it, it will always kick you back down. This story is not about victory or fulfillment or winning. Silent Hill 2 is a story about a lot of other things. It's empathetic. It's revelatory. It's heartbreaking. Through the stories of James, Mary, Angela, Laura, Eddie, and Maria, we find common human ground that no other story that I've ever played through has done in the way it does. There are facets of me and you and everyone and all these people, a mirror with 6 delicate shards scattered across our psyches. James's own clouded, distorted reaction to his wife's death reflects a place I was in a few years ago with someone I loved who died, even though his obfuscations are inherently sinister. Mary's lashing out at the person she loves in the face of something she feels she can't avoid is something that I find painfully empathetic as well. Angela, I don't think I have the words to describe the things I feel from how masterfully she's written. Laura and I are both often abrasive, afraid of being abandoned again. Eddie and I have some body image issues. And finally, even Maria, though some may argue is only a demon invented by the town or something, I can relate to her for her desire to be loved, for her feeling that there's only one thing that she could live for. It's the kind of game that makes you spill your guts everywhere and not even bother cleaning them back up. To discuss Silent Hill 2 is to always reveal a part of yourself in the foggy bathroom mirror, my trauma reflected in yours as well. There's nothing else left to say. It's just a masterpiece. Forgive me for waking you, Silent Hill 2. You're just so special I had to. Thank you all for watching.